I'm in English, yes, good. Welcome to meeting number 12 of the House of Commons Special Committee on Canada-China Relations. Pursuant to the order of reference of July 20, 2020, the committee is meeting on its study on Canada-China relations. Today's meeting is taking place by video conference.
Here are some rules to follow to ensure the smooth running of the meeting. For video conferencing, interpretation services will work much like for regular committee meetings. At the bottom of your screen, you can choose between the sound of the floor, English or French. When you have the floor, if you want to switch from one language to the other, you must also change the interpretation channel to match the language in which you are speaking. It's a good idea to make a short pause between the two languages. Before you start speaking, wait for me to give you the floor by saying your name. When you're ready to speak, you can click on the microphone icon to activate your microphone. If a member wishes to make a point of order, he or she must activate the microphone and indicate that he or she wishes to make a point of order. If a member wishes to speak on a point of order raised by another member, he or she must use the raise your hand function to indicate to the speaker that he or she wishes to speak. To do so, you must click on participants at the bottom of the screen. When the list appears next to your name, you will see an option to raise your hand. Make sure you speak slowly and clearly. When you're unable to speak, or when you don't have the floor, put your microphone on mute. The use of a headset is highly recommended.
Is my sound still working? I have a strange noise in my ear. Madam Clerk, could you confirm that, please? That everything sounds okay?
Mr. Chair, I can hear some static. You can go ahead and I will ask the interpreters if they can still interpret, and I will let you know.
Thank you. And I'd ask members to make sure that they're muted for the time being. So before we get started, can everyone click on their screen in the top right-hand corner and ensure they are on gallery view. With this view, you should be able to see all the participants in a grid view. It will ensure that all video participants can see one another. As is the case during in-person meetings, the public will only see the participant who is speaking. And now, colleagues, we're on to committee business. We have two notices of motion and as well as a motion. So we have two from Mr. Genis and then one from Mr. Harris. Mr. Genis, I presume you'd like to go ahead. Well, which would you like to do first, Mr. Genis?
I'll proceed into debate on the Tibet motion because it's not so much a notice of motion, right? We've already debated it. Debate's been adjourned, so now we're coming back to it.
Okay, I'll read the motion for the benefit of the members, and then I'll go to you for debate, and we'll see who else. I'll keep a list of who else wishes to speak. So the motion moved by Garnet Genis during the meeting of Thursday, August 6th. Debate was adjourned on this motion, and now it's coming back, of course. The motion says that this committee call for dialogue between the Tibetan Central Administration and the government of the People's Republic of China with a view to enabling Tibet to exercise genuine autonomy within the framework of the Chinese Constitution, and report this motion to the House. Et en français que ce comité appelle au dialogue entre l'administration
is reading the same motion in French.
République populaire de Chine en vue de permettre au Tibet l'exercice d'une autonomie véritable dans le cadre de la Constitution chinoise et fasse rapport de cette motion à la Chambre.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll be as brief as possible at the outset. We may be able to proceed on this one quickly. Just to say that the rationale for proposing this motion is that it was a specific ask from the witness testimony, and I think by extension from the community, that we as a committee taking this position clearly does make a difference, does propel the dialogue forward, and that we have an opportunity not only to talk about issues of human rights, but to take constructive action that many people feel will will drive results in terms of dialogue moving towards that accommodation, that genuine autonomy. So I hope we can take this position and contribute constructively to that outcome. And I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jennis. Not seeing any hands up.
My hand is up, Mr. Speaker.
Sorry, Ms. Alislev, over to you, and then Mr. Harris.
So if I could, I'd like to introduce an amendment, a minor amendment to this motion, that after the word between, we insert representatives of the Tibetan people, in brackets, His Holiness and the Dalai Lama or his representatives, and or the Central Tibetan Administration, bracket, and the government of the People's Republic of China. So I know that was pretty quick.
I want to know. I want to check on whether the clerk may need you to repeat that. Let's see, Madam Clerk.
I would like Ms. Alislev to repeat that, please. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Ms. Alislev, if you don't mind.
So from the beginning, that this committee call for dialogue between, and then insert representatives of the Tibetan people, bracket, His Holiness the Dalai Lama or his representatives, and / or the Central Tibetan Administration, bracket.
Thank you.
And the government of the People's Republic of China. So essentially, all we're doing is clarifying that it's not just the Central Tibetan Administration that we would want dialogue between, but could be representatives of the Tibetan people, of which it could be His Holiness the Dalai Lama, his representatives, or the Central Tibetan Administration. So we just wanted to broaden it a bit in terms of who we were saying we would want to have representation and dialogue with the People's Government of the People's Republic of China.
Thank you. Ms. Alislev, did you indicate where the bracket closes? I presume it's after his representatives. Is that correct?
No, it after the Central Tibetan Administration.
Oh,
so
okay.
the bracket is His Holiness the Dalai Lama or his representatives and / or the Central Tibetan Administration. So essentially offering permutations and combinations of 3 elements: the Holiness Dalai Lama, his representatives, or the Central Tibetan Administration. So who would be representing the Tibetan people?
And the wording that I have from Mr. Jennis's motion was the Tibetan Central Administration. I presume that's okay. That you've just changed the order, but I presume the original order is all right. Tibetan Central Administration, and I presume that.
I apologize. I think this. I don't know the answer to that. I think Central Tibetan Administration or Tibetan Central Administration. Garnet.
It's a Central Tibet Administration because it's a name. It's not.
Right.
Yeah.
So yes,
okay.
The Central Tibetan Administration is the correct.
I see. So what we needed to so now we had it incorrect in the well, I guess than what I had here. So that's helpful. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to first, before I go to Mr. Harris, I have to ask for debate on the motion to amend the motion, and on that I see Mr. Harris's hand up.
Yes, this was something unexpected. You know, I think we're being overly prescriptive here. The idea was that we were endorsing the notion of re-engagement of the Sino-Tibetan dialogue in general terms. And wouldn't it be better here to not get too detailed and, in fact, just talk about representatives of the Tibetan people and the Chinese, the government of the People's Republic of China? I would prefer that because we're getting a bit specific, and you know, we're kind of unprepared for this detail here, given the fact that we've only had one witness. And and the debate we had the other day was partly about this issue and the fact that we, you know, we're happy to endorse the dialogue between the Tibetan people and the People's Republic, but by getting very specific, I think we may be going beyond what we have evidence for. So I'm inclined to keep it general and not go into this kind of detail.
Mr. Varani. And then Mr.
Chair,
Oliphant.
thank you, Chair. So we're speaking simply to Ms. Alsalev's suggested amendment, not on the main terms of Mr. Jennis's motion, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So on Ms. Alsalev's amendment, happily, I'd say that I had noted something very similar to the fact that it would be useful to expand out the term of the original text proposed by Mr. Jennis to include something along the lines of and or envoys of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Envoys is usually the term used as a term of art, but representatives works just fine. I do think it's important that we expand it out. I am in agreement with what Ms. Alsalev has suggested in terms of her recommended changes. And the reason, for the benefit of Mr. Harris and others, I think it's important to zoom out a little bit here, pardon the pun since we're on Zoom, but I think it's important to sort of broaden it out is because historically when this dialogue occurred, it occurred actually with envoys of His Holiness the Dalai Lama between 2002 and 2005. It came to an abrupt end once the Central Tibetan Administration became a known entity with political power. And if we restrict it to just a dialogue between the CTA and the People's Republic of China, it may be very simple for that overture to be rejected. If we broaden it out, it allows more options and permutations, which is beneficial for the overall objective, which is, I think, something that all of us likely agree with, which is that this dialogue needs to restart. So I would be in favor of having a broader approach, including the language that Ms. Alsalev had mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Varani. Mr. Oliphant?
I'll just echo that, but to Jack's specific point, I actually think this makes it less specific and makes it a bit broader, so opens up some more options and is a little bit less prescriptive. So it gives a broader range of dialogue partners, and it just honors the fact that we want that dialogue to happen, and we don't want it to be limited by our prescribing which partner it should be. So I am in favor of the amendment.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Bergeron. Vous êtes en sourdine. Vous êtes encore en sourdine, Monsieur Bergeron. Excusez-moi. Désolé.
You're still on mute. I'd like to check with you whether you were saying hands raised, because as soon as you opened the debate, I pushed on the raise hand button and you didn't seem to see me. So I can wave my real hand, and that might be more efficient. But just to come back to the debate, I have a number of comments to make. First of all, on the amendment, I think that it demonstrates the difficulty in which we find ourselves. We need to look at motions and the possibilities of reports when we've heard from the beginning that we can only have one report to publish. If we must continue on these punctual issues, I'd like them to be considered interim reports so that we can continue to discuss the Tibetan matter, for example, and that it not be concluded throughout the motions that we're adopting today. I think that to pick up a Quebec, we're perhaps putting the carts before the horse here, but since the community is expecting us to represent the Tibetan administration, I think that we might need to pass this motion, and I am uncomfortable with that we might find ourselves before this situation. I think this motion is good, but I don't want it to put an end to the deepening of examination of the Tibet issue, and that is why I will support the motion that will be proposed by Mr. Harris, that we will continue our reflection on the situation in Tibet. But I would like to caution us one more time concerning the temptation to pop up with motions that put the committee in an uncomfortable situation, and that mean that we are avoiding getting to the bottom of things, and that we are avoiding making the ties between the different issues. So to come back to Ms. Alislev's motion, personally, I heard Mr. Harris's arguments and what our Liberal colleagues have said so far, and I must say that my first reaction is to say that it's an illustration of the difficult situation we are currently in, that to improve a motion that was thrown at us this way in the middle of a committee meeting, rather than discussing it amongst ourselves. So let's try to avoid this type of maneuvers in the future, because it puts us in a difficult situation. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. First of all, I'm sorry I didn't see your raised hand, and the technicians of the House of Commons tried a few days ago, and I thought they had that she ensure that I become a co-host so that I can see the raised hands, because it's quite important since we're in a Zoom meeting. And I must do many things at once. So I'll change to English.
So are we then ready for the vote on Ms. Alislev's, Jack? Mr. Harris, excuse me.
Thank you, Chair. I listened to what Mr. Oliphant said, and as well, Mr. Virani, and I think that is correct. But I'm given the difficulties we're having, and I want to echo what Mr. Bergeron just said, that the exact wording is not clear because it's not before us. I heard Mr. Virani use the words "and" or to allow the greatest possibility, but I'm not sure that's what's in the actual motion itself. So there's envoys, there's a CTA plus or the Dalai Lama himself. Is that any of those, any combination of those is part of the motion? I'm just is the wording accurate for that? That's the question.
Well, just to be clear, if I'm understanding your question, the Ms. Alislev's motion to amend, right, would insert after the word "between" representatives of the Tibetan people, bracket, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and or his representatives. Sorry, pardon me, excuse me. His Holiness the Dalai Lama or his representatives, and / or, and then after the Central Tibetan Administration, she would insert a close of the bracket. So that would be the change she's proposed. Okay. I hope we can go to a vote because our time is getting low here. Madam Clerk, would you please proceed to a recorded vote?
Mr. Fragiskatos.
In favor.
Mr. Oliphant.
Yes, in favor.
Ms. Yip.
Yes.
Ms. Zan.
In favor.
Mr. Virani.
Yes.
Mr. Albus.
Yes.
Ms. Alislev.
Yes.
Mr. Jennis.
Yes.
Mr. Williamson.
Yes.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Oui.
Mr. Harris.
Yes.
Ms. Alislev's amendment carries.
I declare the motion carried. And now we're on to Mr. Jennis's second motion. I'll just read the English quickly so that we are low on time. That the committee prepare a report on the situation in Hong
Mr. Chair.
Kong. Pardon me?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. We need to vote on the motion as amended.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you so much. Please proceed to
we've had
Mr. Virani.
We've had no debate on that motion
we haven't,
as amended.
So I see Mr. Virani and Mr. Harris wish to debate on the main motion. Mr. Virani?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'll keep it brief. So just in terms of the Sino-Tibetan dialogue, just for the committee's benefit, this was something that was active and ongoing between 2002 and 2005. 4 meetings took place, 3 in the People's Republic, 1 in Switzerland. It came to an abrupt end shortly thereafter. Since it came to an end, Canada has taken the public position that the dialogue should be resumed. I think resuming it is critical. It's critical for the rights of Tibetans who struggle for linguistic, cultural, and religious freedom. It's also critical for clarifying misunderstandings about what the Tibetan cause is all about, for clarifying what the middle way approach seeks to do, which is not a call for rebellion or separatism, but a call for autonomy along those bases, religious, cultural, and linguistic autonomy within the construct and the confines of the Chinese Constitution. It's simply seeking to fulfill the rights that are already guaranteed under that Chinese Constitution. It has been aptly described and articulated by an academic named Michael Van Walt, who I would commend people towards. I've heard the appeals for the resumption of this dialogue from my constituents, from people around the country. I think it is critical, and from the diaspora, literally around the planet, it's critical that we resume it. That is why I and my party would be supporting this motion. I will say that I think the timing is a little bit awkward in terms of doing it right in the middle of the meeting when we do have other motions to consider, like Mr. Harris's proper motion about hearing from others on the Tibetan cause, but I will speak to that when the time arrives. But I will be casting my vote in favor of this motion as amended rightfully by Ms. Alsalev, because broadening it out is a critical step forward. Thank you, Tujiche.
I have Mr. Harris, Mr. Bergeron, and Ms. Alsalev.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'll be brief because I did express my support for this motion at the last time it was raised, with the concern that we hadn't heard from other witnesses on the question in Tibet, and that we ought not to be setting to a precedent of dealing with questions in a piecemeal way. And therefore, I have my own motion put forward, and I understand there's a consensus on that amongst committee members, but we'll see. It's important that we continue with our full study, but this is an important issue for the Tibetan community and the Tibetan people, and I think the fact that the matter is before our committee now, even though somewhat irregularly, I think we should pass it and endorse it, give out our full endorsement. Thank you.
Oui, Monsieur le Président. Rien à ajouter à ce que j'ai déjà eu l'occasion de dire.
I have nothing to add. I would still be in favor of this motion as amended, while cautioning once again against the temptation to propose sudden motion amendments. We need to have an overall complete report so that we can put ties between the different issues there. So there you have it, Mr. Speaker.
Sorry, I'm not hearing the chair.
You're on mute, Mr. Chair.
That's entirely my fault. I'm sorry. I have Ms. Alsalev and then Mr. Oliphant.
Apologies, Mr. Chair. I didn't have my hand up this time.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Oliphant.
I am just going to say that, yes, I support the motion as amended. I think it's important. However, I am looking for a general nodding of heads and an agreement in a gentle person's way that this does not preclude us continuing study on Tibet. I think that we've only heard from one witness on Tibet. I don't think that's appropriate. I would much sooner, as Mr. Bergeron has said, wait until we've heard from other witnesses. I know Mr. Harris will be bringing something, but I just want to trust that we have an agreement on the committee that this doesn't mean we're done with Tibet and that we will continue. Otherwise, I couldn't vote for this motion. So we're in a kind of an awkward situation that we've been put in, as Mr. Bergeron has said, that we, of course, want to support this motion, but someone could at a subcommittee say, well, we've done Tibet, now let's just move on. And I think civil society, I think Canadians of Tibetan origin, I think officials, all of those things we need to consider. So for a full report on Canada-China, we need that. So I just kind of need a shaking of a head, yes. I'm getting it from Leona. When we're in a room, we can kind of read body language. I'm seeing it from Garnet. So Dan, we're okay with that?
You have it.
Okay.
And I see still the hands up of Mr. Harris and Mr. Bergeron, but that may be from their previous. Yeah, that's so. Remember to take those hands down once you're done, if you don't mind. I thought they expired automatically, but apparently not. So I'd ask the clerk then to proceed to the recorded vote on the motion.
This is a vote on the motion as amended. Mr. Fragas-Katos.
Yes.
Mr. Oliphant.
Yes.
Ms. Yip,
Yes.
Ms. Zan,
Yes.
Mr. Varani,
Yes.
Mr. Albus,
Yes.
Ms. Alislev,
Yes.
Mr. Jenis,
Yes.
Mr. Williamson,
Yes.
Monsieur Bergeron,
Oui.
Mr. Harris.
Yes.
Motion as amended carries.
Thank you very much. We're at the end of our half hour. Madam Clerk, can you assist me a bit here? Just a second.
We have our 3 witnesses waiting in the waiting room, but they've been told that we are doing committee business and it might be a bit longer. So it's up to the committee to proceed in the way that they wish to proceed.
Fine. So, Mr. Jenis, you'd like to proceed with your motion?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I would. I think hopefully if we take an extra 15 minutes, we have time for my motion and Mr. Harris's motion, because I want to make sure he has the opportunity as well. But since I have the floor, I'll just move quickly that notice of my motion has been given. It's with respect to having a report at the end of this Hong Kong study. And just to briefly motivate this, we are dealing with urgent unfolding events. It's important that we report on them to the House of Commons when we're finished this study. We can't wait till the end of a macro discussion of Canada-China relations. The ground in terms of what's happening in Hong Kong may have shifted substantially between now and that future time. Also, I mean, everybody knows we're in a minority parliament. Mr. Blanchette talking about putting forward a non-confidence motion. We could be in a situation at any time where we go to an election, and if that happens, we won't have time to take all of this and put it into a report. So I think part of the necessity for interim report on Hong Kong, the urgency of the situation, but also the fact that a lot of that work might just end up being lost. So I hope that as a procedural matter, committee members will agree that when we finish our hearings on Hong Kong, we will take what we've learned. We will do our job, which is to advise Parliament, advise the government based on what we've heard. And I think providing that feedback specifically about the situation in Hong Kong will be very important. So that's the rationale for this motion. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I have Mr. Oliphant, Ms. Alislev, and Mr. Harris. Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Chair, I'm predisposed to support the motion. However, Mr. Jenis's argument just actually made me more nervous about supporting it. When he said that he wants to do this because the ground could shift by the time we actually get to our major report, means we could have an irrelevant report. So I would need a clarification from him on why he would think that it would be better to have a report now, which I had been totally willing to support until he sort of raised that argument counter to having a report now, because I don't want to look like an irrelevant parliamentarian who's making a report for the sake of making a report. That's not why I got elected to Parliament. I got elected to make a difference on public policy issues. And if the ground is shifting, why wouldn't we want to make sure that we're going to do it? Still predisposed to support the motion, but that argument worries me. Secondly, and it would really fall into a point of order, Mr. Chair, as opposed to a point of debate. So I would raise a point of order that I would like you to rule on how long we will be in this portion of the meeting. I think that's, and then we would come to an end to allow witnesses who have been invited. So I think the clerk mentioned 15 minutes, but I didn't hear from you. I just think it would be fair for committee members, for our own preparation, as well as for invited witnesses, to know when we will end this debate. We might have reached a vote by then or not, but I just think that's fair for us to know that.
I'm in the hands of the committee, I think, in that regard. Obviously, I'm anxious to get to the witnesses, but the committee members have the right to bring forward a motion and have it debated, and that's where we are at the moment. And I recognize the desire from some members to do that expeditiously. By the way, I can see the hands now when they are raised. You'll want to know. Ms. Oleslev?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to echo what Mr. Garnett and perhaps provide some clarification based on my understanding of what Mr. Garnett said. We were thinking that the landscape here at home, as a result of the minority government, might change at any time, and so we don't want our work on this committee to not to be lost and not have the opportunity to be put forward to the government to be able to consider it as they might, or all parties, if by some chance we found ourselves in election. I mean, there's no question that committees are incredibly important. We know that this China committee is very important, which is why we brought it back and are doing this incredible study in such an intense and compressed time frame, because we believe what we are learning is of value and that Canadian citizens want to understand what we have learned. So part of our responsibility as parliamentarians is to be able to provide that information in a report that informs, advises not only the government, but also the Canadian public. And I would hate for us to just do a study for the sake of study and not be able to provide that very important feedback in terms of the report that can be used by government and Canadian public at large on such an important topic. And so that's why I think there is a sense of urgency, and that's why I think there is substantive value in providing a timely and comprehensive report on this subject, so that we don't miss all this great work that we've done over the last few weeks. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, you're on mute.
My fault. Mr. Harris?
Thank you, Chair. And I want to speak in support of this motion for none of the reasons that Ms. Aliyev just referred to. In fact, if that were the reason, I wouldn't support it. The government is the government until it isn't. The reason that I'm supporting this, contrary to our normal role of waiting till we get all it to talk about the relationship between Canada and China, is because there is a sense of urgency in some of the measures that are being proposed, particularly those that would offer assistance to people who are affected now by this changes in the relationship in Hong Kong, between Hong Kong and Beijing. That's the reason for the urgency, in my view, that we should put what we have on the table so that the government can act and we can try to influence the course of the government's activities while it is the government. And that could be longer than people think. It could be shorter than people think, but that has nothing to do with my support for this motion. I think we should do it because it's important. But it is an exception to the overall thrust of having a report at the end, which we're all endeavoring to do. And this is an exception as a result of the urgency of the matters before us. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Avant de donner la parole à Monsieur Bergeron.
Before I give the floor to Mr. Bergeron, I'd like to tell him that I now can see when hands are raised. Mr. Bergeron. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I totally agree with what Mr. Harris just said. That is, that given what I said a few minutes ago regarding Tibet, I should be against this motion, which goes against the idea of having a one global holistic report of the whole situation at the end. But we heard a certain number of witnesses and testimonies that lead us to make some urgent recommendation to the government of Canada in terms of immigration, for instance. So we can't wait the end of our study. So for that reason, I support this motion. But this is just an interim report. We will have the opportunity later to establish the necessary links between the situation in Hong Kong and other situations, such as the one in Taiwan, in our global report. So for the reasons I just gave you, I would support this motion, but only for these reasons. There are things that we need to do right away to help activists who want to leave Hong Kong. I believe that we need to adopt an interim report on the situation in Hong Kong. Thank you. Mr. Bergeron.
Mr. Jennings, your hand is up still. Did you wish to speak again?
I was going to speak, but I feel that I could make matters worse, and we already have a majority. So I think it's probably in my own interest not to say anything further at this point.
That can be a very wise approach at times. Mr. Oliphant, your hand is still up?
Well, I rarely take, but thank you.
Mr. Oliphant and then Mr. Harris again, if your hands are both up. So, Mr. Oliphant? Sorry, you're muted still.
Sorry, I forgot to lower. I forgot to lower hand. I agree with Janice Garnett on that point.
Mr. Harris?
I just want to emphasize that I consider this an interim report as well, although it's not called that, but it should not preclude us from referencing the situation in Hong Kong in our overall report at the end. And we should probably, whatever report we do prepare, make sure it's directed at basically the here and now situation. Thank you.
All right. I don't see any additional hands. I see Mr. Oliphant's hand still up and Mr. Harris's, but I trust they'll take those down, I think. And then therefore, I'll call upon the clerk to proceed to the recorded vote, please.
Before I do, I simply wanted to confirm that we can go until 2:15 this afternoon, not longer than that, because there is another committee in that room at 3 o'clock today.
I think we'd better try to be on time. So, Madam Clerk, please proceed.
Mr. Fragiskatos.
Yes.
Mr. Oliphant.
Yes.
Ms. Yip.
Yes, sorry.
Madame Zan.
Yes.
Monsieur Dubourg.
Hello, I think it's supposed to be Mr. Arif.
Puisque vous êtes ici en temps normal.
Since you are here, it should be you, but I will ask Mr. Virani.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. I think Mr. DeBourg is going to sub in from you when we're done with the business part of this meeting, and I know it's gone on a little bit longer, but I will be voting in favor of this motion. Thank you.
Mr. Albus.
Favor.
Ms. Alislev.
Yes.
Mr. Jennings.
Yes.
Mr. Williamson.
Yes.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Oui.
Mr. Harris.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Chair, you're mute.
Merci beaucoup. Je déclare la motion adoptée.
I declare the motion carried.
I believe.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I don't think this will take long. I would like to move that the committee invite officials from Global Affairs Canada to provide a briefing on the situation in Tibet and Canada's relationship at the earliest opportunity as part of our ongoing study on Canada's relationship with China. I'll speak to it briefly if you wish.
Yes, please do. And then I have Mr. Albus.
Yes, this has been discussed with the vice chairs, and I believe that there will be support for this. It's part of my understanding that we would, in support, as part of my support for the earlier motion, to ensure that we hear more about China, in particular from officials as to the history. We've get some of it from Mr. Virani today, but I would like to hear the officials give us the story about the relationship and whatever other evidence that others may want to call. But I think starting with the officials, it would be a good place to start, and we can do that at the earliest opportunity that presents itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Albus. Then Mr. Bergeron.
Thanks for supporting Mr. Harris's motion, although I don't think we really even need to have a vote. I think that, quite honestly, there'll be consensus and we can move right to witnesses. But just on the point, if we are going to have a debate on the motion, if you find it's in order, then I would just simply say I don't substantially change our mind from the motion that was passed earlier, but I always do believe more information is important. And this committee, we are asked often by the rest of our members of Parliament to know a lot about every issue, every facet. So I think I will be supporting this, and more information is good in my mind.
You're on
Monsieur
mute.
Bergeron, excusez-moi.
Mr. Bergeron, thank you, Mr. Chair. I already talked a few minutes ago, so I support this type of motion, which will allow us to get in deeper on Tibet. We will be able to integrate this in our global report. So I support this motion. Thank you.
Mr. Albus, I don't think you're aware that your hand is still up, so you may want to take that down, please. Yeah. And I see Mr. Varani. Mr. Varani.
I think this is apropos of what Mr. Harris just mentioned. I think, and given what Mr. Oliphant said sort of 10 minutes ago, I think just having, again, I'm not trying to complicate matters, but having some language perhaps inserted that just allows for the possibility of others, people like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Michael Van Walt, the academic I mentioned in the earlier part of the meeting. There are a number of people that have expertise in this area. So giving some wiggle room in the language of the current text so that it's not just one briefing from GAC officials, but the potential for further guests or witnesses to speak to Tibet would be welcome. But I'm not picky as to what the wordsmithing looks like, but just allowing for that in the text of this motion.
So it sounds like you're asking Mr. Harris if he's agreeable to that. Mr. Harris, do you wish to respond?
Yeah, well, I think this doesn't preclude any other witnesses from being called, but I don't know if we want to go into amending the motion at this point. But I think this is something that would likely be referred to the subcommittee, and the subcommittee can give consideration to that. So I'd prefer to do it just as is, but I'm not opposed to other witnesses being called.
Thank you, and I'll just remind you to lower your hand. So I guess we can go to the clerk if you don't mind. Oh no, Mr. Oliphant.
I would just add that I think that agreement we had earlier around other witnesses, I'm going to take that as something we take to the subcommittee. We'll hear this, but we'll also look at this debate and be reminded that we were requested to look at Amnesty or Human Rights Watch or academics or Canadian Tibetans to that. So I think we're in agreement on that. I'm sort of noticing nodding or nodding off, and it looks okay.
Thank you very much. Madam Clerk, please proceed to the recorded vote.
Mr. Fragiskatos.
Yes.
Mr. Oliphant.
Yes.
Miss Yip.
Yes.
Miss Zan.
Yes.
Mr. Varani.
Yes.
Mr. Albus.
Yes.
Miss Alislev.
Yes.
Mr. Jenis.
Yes.
Mr. Williamson. Mr. Williamson.
Pardon me, yes.
Mr. Bergeron.
Oui.
Mr. Harris.
Yes.
Motion carried.
I declare the motion adopted. Thank you very much, colleagues. And now we need to have a very short pause to make sure we add all of the witnesses, Madam Clerk.
That is correct, and we need to do quick sound checks as well.
So we'll take as few minutes as possible. Hope if we're lucky, less than 5. See you shortly. The meeting is suspended. Committee back to order. Welcome back. I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of the new witnesses. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. When you are ready to speak, you can click on the microphone icon to activate your mic. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. Interpretation in this video conference will work very much like in a regular committee meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. As you are speaking, if you plan to alternate from one language to the other, you will need to also switch the interpretation channel so it aligns with the language you're speaking. You may want to allow for a short pause when switching languages. A reminder to witnesses that if you require French interpretation, you should be selecting your English channel on the bottom of your screen, and vice versa if you need English interpretation. When you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute, please. The use of headsets is strongly encouraged, as you've seen. And I just would say that once we're into questioning by members, they will indicate, I hope, who they'd like to answer the question. And when they call on you to answer a question, you don't have to wait for me to call on you. You can proceed. And at the end of the time they have, I will interrupt if I have to and go on to the next member. So I'd like to now begin with welcome our first panel of witnesses. From Georgetown University, we have Evan S. Medeiros, Penner Family Chair in Asia Studies. From the New York University School of Law, Alvin Y.H. Chung, non-resident affiliated scholar, U.S. Asia Law Institute. From the University of Toronto, Lynette H. Ong, Professor of Political Science and Global Affairs. Each witness or organization, well, I guess it's each witness in this case because there's only one from each, will have up to 10 minutes to make an opening statement followed by a round of questions from the members. We'll begin with Mr. Medeiros from Georgetown University. Mr. Medeiros, 10 minutes. And please unmute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a distinct pleasure and privilege to be invited to appear before this Parliamentary Special Committee on Canada-China Relations. I applaud your focus on Canada-China relations in general and today's topic of Hong Kong in all of its manifestations is perhaps the most consequential challenge in global affairs. For nations to respond effectively, all countries need to engage in the very kind of national conversation that your committee is promoting about how to respond to China's rise. My comments today will focus on or reflect my perspective as both a scholar and a former senior U.S. policymaker. I've spent 25 years researching and writing about China as both an analyst at the RAND Corporation and, of course, as a professor at Georgetown University. In the last 6 years, I served on the staff of the U.S. National Security Council under President Obama as director for China, and then as special assistant to President Obama and senior director for Asia. In today's session, I'd like to make three broad points about the Hong Kong situation. First, the international community should expect the situation in Hong Kong to get worse before it stabilizes. Beijing's actions in recent weeks are a leading indicator, not a lagging one, of Hong Kong's deteriorating political trajectory under Beijing's hand. On July 1st, Carrie Lam announced the September Legislative Council elections will be postponed for a year, and on the same day, Hong Kong authorities issued arrest warrants for 6 activists based abroad, including a U.S. citizen, for, quote, incitement to secession and collusion with foreign forces. Then on August 10th, just last week, Jimmy Lai and several other media executives were arrested, as was Agnes Chow, former leader of the pro-democracy organization Demosisto. These actions clearly signal Beijing has no interest in preserving the basic political freedoms at the heart of the joint declaration, the basic law, and ultimately the one country, two systems model, which collectively have been so important to Hong Kong's success today. The fact that Chinese internal security and intelligence services will now be able to openly operate in Hong Kong only increases the mainland's ability to use fear, intimidation, and ultimately coercion to keep opposition voices silent. Beijing's overall approach, in my assessment, is to use the national security law to separate politics from business in Hong Kong. It wants to preserve the latter while neutering the former. In short, Beijing wants Hong Kong to remain capitalist, especially the continued functioning of vibrant financial markets, but not liberal in its politics and therefore beholden to the Chinese Communist Party for political governance. Ultimately, this strategy will lead to, perhaps in a decade, the diminution of Hong Kong as the center for finance in East Asia. As the risk and constraints of operating in Hong Kong grow, global financial firms and non-financial corporations will gradually reduce their footprint in Hong Kong as they move some of their operations onto mainland China and their non-China operations to elsewhere in Asia. Thus, Hong Kong will gradually become a quirky, nostalgia-laden version of a southern Chinese city consumed by the fact that its best days are in the rearview mirror. My second overall point is that the fate of Hong Kong will assume greater importance in global politics, largely by dint of its impact on U.S.-China relations. China's crackdown in Hong Kong will worsen the suspicion and mistrust at the heart of the U.S.-China relationship. More pointedly, it will fuel an incipient ideological competition between the United States and China. Hong Kong will become a focal point for and symbol of U.S.-China competition over the value of liberal ideals. Indeed, Beijing's crackdown on Hong Kong could not have come at a worse time, as the U.S. is and will remain in the process of reassessing the nature of the China challenge and recalibrating its strategies and policies accordingly. China's treatment of Hong Kong has accentuated the differences in values between the United States and China. This is translated into a perception that China is actively trying to undermine liberal rules and norms globally, which in turn has produced a debate in the United States about whether China represents a systemic rival to the United States and other democracies. My third and final point is that Canada, the United States, and other major democracies need to stay engaged and active on the Hong Kong issue. Our country's voices and actions matter now and going forward. While our leverage to change the situation on the ground is admittedly limited, there is much that can be done to shape the overall trajectory of Hong Kong, as well as to shape possible future actions by China. These actions fall into several categories. First, the United States and Canada should publicly and continually reassure the people of Hong Kong, as well as like-minded countries all over the world, that our governments will stand up for the protection of universal values. The Hong Kong situation will be a long-term challenge, and the international community, especially the United States and Canada, need to be organized for the long game and not just focused on scoring points against Beijing's excesses right now. The two joint statements by the United States, Canada, UK, and Australia to date are important in this regard, as was the G7 foreign minister statement. Our country should broaden this coalition to include others, notably Japan, South Korea, and EU countries, the new international parliamentary commissions on China in the UK, in the EU Parliament, and Japan offer another opportunity to send such signals. Second recommendation, the United States and Canada should take coordinated action to signal to China that there are costs for its crackdown. The logic of such actions is to give Beijing pause when it considers additional actions against Hong Kong. The recent decisions by several countries to withdraw from or suspend their extradition treaties to Hong Kong was an important first step in this regard. One notable idea being considered is for a group of countries to follow the UK in opening their door to Hong Kong residents who wish to emigrate. A related idea is to offer scholarships to young Hong Kong residents who wish to study in the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and elsewhere. Third recommendation, the United States and China should work, the United States and Canada should work with the international business community to find creative ways to preserve the unique attributes and identity of Hong Kong to the extent possible. Beijing must avoid actions that substantially undercut the business environment in Hong Kong, especially related to global financial institutions. Thus, it may listen to the concerns of local and business leaders about restrictions such as internet controls and law enforcement actions that undermine business confidence about operating in Hong Kong. The business community in Hong Kong may be helpful in pushing Beijing to retain some of Hong Kong's vibrancy. My last and final point is that the US, Canada, and other governments should work in coordination to take actions that disabuse Beijing from the belief that it could extend its coercion to Taiwan. I remain very concerned that Beijing could draw the wrong conclusions about the international community's response to Hong Kong, which over time could lead it to extend such an approach to Taiwan. Thank you for the opportunity to present my views today. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we'll go to Ms. Chung from the New York University School of Law. Ms. Chung, you have up to 10 minutes. Please unmute. Mr. Chung, excuse me. Mr. Chung.
Mr. Chair, thank you for inviting me to give evidence today. My academic work at NYU focuses on authoritarian abuses of law in Hong Kong and elsewhere. I'm also a Canadian citizen of Hong Kong origin, and I practiced law in Hong Kong for several years. You've already heard at length from other witnesses about developments in Hong Kong. I want to underscore the specific importance of these events to Canada. Although my remarks focus on the National Security Law, or NSL, I should emphasize that other developments, such as the growing politicization of the civil service and widespread impunity in the uniformed services, are also deeply troubling. I will gladly address these topics in questioning. I will make 3 points today. First, events in Hong Kong are bad for Canadian businesses operating there. Second, events in Hong Kong are bad for Canadian citizens, both inside and outside of Hong Kong. And third, events in Hong Kong directly implicate Canadian foreign policy priorities. One of the main attractions of Hong Kong for Canadian businesses is the perception that it maintains the rule of law. This is ultimately about not being subject to arbitrary exercises of state power, and it is about being able to anticipate with reasonable certainty what you can or cannot do. The NSL imposes a parallel legal system, one with poorly defined offenses, unaccountable secret police, and harsh penalties on Hong Kong. This system will displace the normal legal system whenever the authorities invoke national security. Simply put, whether normal law applies to you depends on the whim of the state. Even normal administrative institutions that businesses rely upon, like the Companies Registry, have been politically captured. Since 2014, several opposition parties, including Joshua Wong's Parti Demosisto, have been denied corporate registration, hampering their ability to rent offices or raise funds. For at least 3 reasons, political apathy will not protect the business community. First, businesses in Hong Kong face tremendous political pressure to support the NSL publicly. Second, businesses will be forced to choose between complying with the NSL and complying with other regulatory regimes, including US sanctions. Third, normal business matters may increasingly be characterized as implicating national security. For instance, any financial analyst whose conclusions could be interpreted as undermining public confidence in the Hong Kong or Beijing governments may be at risk of being prosecuted under the NSL. Numerous chambers of commerce opposed the rendition bill in 2019 because they feared anyone present in or transiting through Hong Kong would be rendered to the mainland and subjected to its criminal law system. Having largely failed to bring people in Hong Kong within the reach of mainland criminal law, Beijing has brought mainland criminal law to them. Events in Hong Kong also have grave consequences for Canadian citizens, whether or not they currently live in Hong Kong. There are over 300,000 Canadians in Hong Kong. All of them must now live in fear of the possible consequences of violating the NSL, which include being rendered to mainland China, prosecuted in mainland courts, and sentenced to life imprisonment. Even a brief reading of the NSL will reveal that it defines its offences in extremely broad terms. In the circumstances, there can be no meaningful certainty as to what will or will not be treated as an NSL violation. When the Chinese authorities assert, as they have done repeatedly, that the NSL will only be used against a small number of people, they are implicitly admitting that they have extremely broad enforcement discretion. Yet they have said very little about how that discretion will be exercised or regulated. This is antithetical to the rule of law. The chilling effects of the NSL also extend to Canadian citizens within Canada. As has already been noted by other witnesses, the NSL encompasses acts done outside Hong Kong by people who are not permanent residents of Hong Kong. Consequently, any Canadian who might have to travel to Hong Kong, transit through Hong Kong, or take a flight operated by a Hong Kong-based airline now faces considerable pressure to self-censor. Canadian citizens like me should be able to participate in the Canadian political process without fearing reprisals if they travel to or through Hong Kong. Canadian citizens of Hong Kong descent are at particular risk. Many of them, particularly those living in Hong Kong, are also deemed to be PRC nationals under PRC law. As the PRC does not recognize dual citizenship, these individuals are at risk of being denied consular access in the event that they are detained in Hong Kong. Evidence also suggests that the PRC has coerced individuals into renouncing foreign citizenship or claims to consular assistance. On June 30th this year, a PRC court sentenced Sun Qian, a Canadian citizen, to 8 years in prison for being a Falun Gong practitioner. She purported to renounce Canadian citizenship in the process, likely due to coercion by Chinese authorities. Similarly, Hong Kong-based booksellers Gui Minhai and Li Bo, of citizens of Sweden and the UK respectively, have also purported to renounce foreign citizenships in circumstances suggesting duress. Canadian citizens with ties to Hong Kong must now consider whether what they say in Canada will be used against them in the event that they so much as set foot on a Hong Kong registered airliner. In addition, protests in Canada expressing support for Hong Kong have been met with counter-protests and provocateurs, and their participants subjected to harassment and intimidation. PRC consular officials in this country have publicly praised such acts of retaliation. Events in Hong Kong also have implications for Canadian foreign policy. First, the NSL will inhibit the Canadian government's ability to obtain accurate information about developments in Hong Kong and China. Any Canadian citizen based in Hong Kong may face prosecution for doing what I'm doing today. Second, China's conduct in Hong Kong reflects poorly on its willingness to abide by other international commitments. Since 2014, mainland and Hong Kong officials have publicly and repeatedly declared the Sino-British Joint Declaration to be a dead letter, even though it remains in force until 2047. The failure of the international community, Canada included, to condemn these repudiations has contributed to the climate of impunity under which the PRC now operates in Hong Kong. Against that background, one might reasonably wonder whether the PRC will abide by its other bilateral and multilateral commitments. Third, and most significantly, the ongoing events in Hong Kong are an acid test for Canada's willingness to uphold its commitments. For the reasons I've set out, the situation in Hong Kong threatens the personal safety of Canadian citizens in Hong Kong and in Canada. It also imperils Canadian businesses in Hong Kong. This country has an obligation to protect them. Perhaps more importantly, how Canada reacts to developments in Hong Kong will speak volumes as to who we are and what values we share. Our government is publicly committed to revitalizing the rules-based international order in conjunction with regional, bilateral, and multilateral partners. I hope that whatever steps the Special Committee recommends and whatever steps the government ultimately chooses to take will live up to these stated commitments to multilateralism and the rule of law. I'll now be happy to take questions and to deliver supplemental written answers if need be.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chung, and we'll now go to Professor Ong at the University of Toronto. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm grateful for this opportunity to appear before the committee. Let me begin with a statement of positionality. So my perspectives on the situation in Hong Kong are shaped by my work in and on China, first as a consultant and later as an academic since the late 1990s. I've been based at the University of Toronto for the last 14 years, the first and only academic position I've ever held. The national security law has potential widespread consequences. As a China scholar, I think about delivery of content over online platforms and preservation of the rigor and integrity of the courses I teach. I think about the safety of my students participating online, either in Toronto or from their home countries. I think about the feasibility of sustaining my own research agenda. I also think about my Hong Kong-based colleagues who are at the forefront of the battle against erosion of academic freedom. So the law's potential impact on the wider academic community who engages with Hong Kong and China is profound. But we should also be mindful that this is not the first time the mettle of the China scholarly community has been tested. The last time was in 1989. And yet we endure, we adapt, and eventually we continue to thrive. When the law was first proposed, my initial assessment was that it would merely legalize the underground repression that Beijing has applied on Hong Kong for over a decade. My own research suggests that covert repression through proxy, or those taken out of the public eyes, have been ongoing in Hong Kong for some time, such as kidnapping of banned booksellers and the Yuan Long attack in July 2019. However, recent events, I think, unambiguously suggest that the law has actually emboldened and further legalized crackdown on freedom of speech and civil liberties. Furthermore, because of the law's deliberately vague wording, it has produced a chilling effect on Hong Kong society and beyond. It is a clear violation of the one country, two system principle in the Basic Law. However, moving forward, the situation in Hong Kong may go in one of these two directions. Number one, I think Beijing may intensify its crackdown, further eroding Hong Kong's autonomy and the space for civil society to operate. Number two, the repression may taper off after the initial round of harsh crackdown. One could argue that because the law is so new, its first set of application was deliberately harsh in order to set a precedent for, as well as to produce demonstrative effect on any would-be violators. So in my view, which of these two ways the situation will evolve depends on the value of Hong Kong to the CCP, to the Chinese Communist Party elites. Despite rising competitiveness of Chinese cities such as Shanghai and Shenzhen, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange remains the most favorable venue for Chinese companies to raise capital. Furthermore, a recent New York Times investigative report suggests that families of the party elites own more than US 50 million worth of luxury homes in Hong Kong. So I think this is an indication of the political as well as personal vested interest of Beijing's top elites in the continued prosperity of Hong Kong. These elites in turn form the core support base of President Xi's leadership. Losing this critical support will render the leadership vulnerable. So in many respects, Hong Kong and the national security law are a double-edged sword for the CCP leadership. On the one hand, they want to introduce the law to stop violent protests from wreaking havoc on the economy, which will hurt their interests. On the other hand, the law will invite sanctions, which it has from the US, that will erode Hong Kong's attractiveness as an international capital center and a regional business hub. So far, I think the evidence on Hong Kong's economic competitiveness has been rather mixed. In the past 6 months, Chinese companies have raised more capital in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and deepened its investment in the territory. However, revoking Hong Kong's special trade status has actually raised the tariff levels that goods coming into and out of Hong Kong are subjected to the same levels as those from mainland China. And a recent poll by the American Chamber of Commerce suggests that 4 out of 10 companies are planning to move their regional headquarters away from Hong Kong. So this brings me to my next point, which is what actions Canada should or should not take. I think overall Canada should send a very clear message that we condemn the repression on Hong Kong and we stand by the people of Hong Kong. However, in my view, whatever punitive measures we come up with need to pay careful consideration to the dual nature of Hong Kong to the CCP leadership. I think Hong Kong is a goose that lays the golden eggs, as well as a rebellious child that needs to be disciplined. So this is from the CCP leadership's perspective. If we impose measures that further erode the function of the goose, Hong Kong's value will diminish to that of a rebellious entity that we have seen examples of. And the consequences of that is obvious. So to put it plainly, if we kill the goose, we may end up hurting Hong Kong's quest for freedom and autonomy more than helping it. And my number 2 recommendations is I support Canada opening its door to immigration, to welcome immigration and talent from Hong Kong. And number 3, I think I also would recommend Canadian government as well as the university sector to offer scholarships for students from Hong Kong. In the short run, I think we should be under no illusion that freedom of expression will return to Hong Kong, or the people of Hong Kong will be given universal suffrage as promised by the Basic Law. Upon the signing of the Sino-British Joint Declaration in 1984, many Western observers had hoped that Hong Kong offers a beacon of hope that democracy will one day arrive in China through Hong Kong. And this has proved to be a pipe dream so far. I think we should be also under no illusion that maintaining trade with China, trade alone will push the country to become more open, as many had hoped when they supported China's entry to the WTO in 2001. Nor should we fool ourselves that if we afford China the respect the size of its country deserved, the respect will be reciprocated. I think the fate of Mr. Kubrick and Mr. Spavor, who have been detained by China for more than 600 days, suggests that it is not a country that actually plays by the rules. The collateral damage of the pandemic that no country has managed to escape so far, I think further illustrates the externalities of China's authoritarian political system. So I believe that to properly tackle the situation in Hong Kong without addressing how we should cope with the rise of China, I think these 2 problems are deeply, deeply intertwined. So I'm pessimistic in the short run. However, in the medium and the long run, I believe that the resilience of Hong Kong as a city and the people shaped by the fiercely entrepreneurial, creative, and industrious migrant culture will prevail. And I remain hopeful that a vibrant and free Hong Kong will eventually return. Thank you for the opportunity to share my perspective.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank all the witnesses, each of the witnesses for keeping it under 10 minutes, which will allow us more time for questions. Before we start questions, I just want to alert members we probably won't have time for the full 2 rounds in either this or the second panel, because I'm going to try to balance the 2 and get us in at least close to our time. We'll begin with Mr. Jennis in the first round for 6 minutes. Mr. Jennis, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. The Chinese government often tries to use a bogus cultural argument to justify its repression, and for that reason, their efforts to snuff out freedom in Hong Kong are part of a strategy to try and take away freedoms enjoyed by Chinese areas. Of course, Taiwan is a similar counterexample. Taiwan shows how Chinese culture is very much compatible with freedom and democracy, and I was very struck by the sense that this is one step into Hong Kong, and then the next step will be Taiwan, and we saw a similar pattern of action with let's say Nazi Germany going to Czechoslovakia and then to Poland, and so I'd like Mr. Medeiros, if you could speak a little bit to you spoke about Taiwan. How do we arrest this process? How do we respond to the situation in Hong Kong in a way that deters this next step into likely what is the next aggressive action planned by the Xi Jinping regime?
Thank you very much. Excellent question, and I share your concern about what conclusions Beijing might draw. I think it's important to keep in mind that this is not the prelude to World War II. There are important differences, historic differences in the situation. And the reason I raised Hong Kong is the reason I raised the Taiwan question was because I was concerned that if there is sort of insufficient solidarity in the West about the situation in Hong Kong, then in the future, if the situation deteriorates over Taiwan, that Beijing could come to the conclusion that the costs were not, were worth bearing. They really weren't that high, and that America, Canada, the UK, Australia would eventually get over it. But Taiwan's a very different situation. largely because it's physically separated from the mainland, and because it would probably take some kind of major military action to bring about the type of, situation in Taiwan that it has over Hong Kong. I mean, most basically, it has sovereignty, and the international community recognizes it has sovereignty. So it in terms of deterring actions on Taiwan, it fundamentally comes down to a sort of military security type of issue, which is a large feature of U.S. defense policy. Sorry.
Yeah, if I can just follow up, I mean, I understand, of course, there's always differences when you try to make analogies to historic events, but is perhaps a better analogy kind of the Western response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where perhaps Putin had larger designs, and yet by inflicting significant economic and other consequences on Russia because of that invasion, it didn't stop the annexation of Crimea, but it slowed down what might have been intended as a larger advance. Do you think that lesson is applicable, where if we have a strong, coordinated international response, and Canada played a leadership role in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, so if we have a strong, coordinated international response, we can maybe it doesn't stop the current aggression, but it's more likely to deter future aggression by showing that aggression has high costs?
Basically, I agree. It fundamentally comes down to what are the best mechanisms, diplomatic, economic, and military, that will give Beijing pause about taking future actions. So something that I've written about is I was concerned that the sort of moderate international response to the Russian invasion of Georgia didn't cause the invasion of Ukraine, but it definitely sort of created an enabling environment. It was one of the contributing factors. And I think we need to be mindful of that with Hong Kong. But as I and others have stressed, you don't want to shoot the hostage. Killing Hong Kong right now in your effort to deter some notional Chinese response to Taiwan in the future doesn't support our values or our interests either.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that the point on Georgia is very interesting. I have a minute left. I just want to ask you one more question you spoke about a multilateral response. Everybody on this committee, every party believes that we want to have a multilateral response. My concern is that sometimes people use the need for multilateralism as an excuse to say we shouldn't act first. Oh, we need multilateral, so let's sit around and kind of wait for something multilateral to happen. But what I heard you say is that responding in a multilateral way means that we start with the coalitions we have and seek to expand them. So we be prepared to take action right now in concert with the United States, and we seek to enlarge those coalitions, but we don't wait for some mythical complete coalition to emerge. What are your thoughts on that?
Generally, I agree. The fact that the US, the UK, Canada, and Australia have already started to act is a good thing. And I think adding South Korea, Japan, and others is smart. So I don't think it's a question of inaction. It's a question of how do you go bigger and broader in terms of participation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Genis. Mr. Fadriskatos, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. I want to begin with Professor Medeiros. And Professor, I only have 6 minutes, as you know. So if you could spend a couple minutes on the following. And it's a question not directly relating to Hong Kong, but it's important because Canada's foreign policy choices, even with respect to Hong Kong, I think will be shaped by the evolution of the U.S.-China relationship. Recently, you gave an interview to NPR Radio in which you said the following about U.S.-China relations. The two countries have gone through some very difficult times in 1989 and afterwards, after the Tiananmen Square massacre, but it looks like these countries are increasingly on a trajectory to a long-term strategic competition. So where do you see the U.S.-China relationship going? Because, as I said, it does shape, I think, Canada's foreign policy choices indirectly, and even with respect to Hong Kong.
Thanks. It's a great question. I've spent my entire professional career studying the U.S.-China relationship, and then when I was at the National Security Council, I was fortunate enough to basically be at the control panel. And my considered judgment today is that the relationship is not only on a trajectory towards strategic competition, but perhaps strategic confrontation if the Trump administration continues in the different direction. And I worked for President Obama, so I have a lot of differences with the current trajectory. But you have to understand that there are structural problems at the heart of the U.S.-China relationship. We have differences over security issues like Taiwan, U.S. forces in East Asia. We have differences over economic issues. We have differences over technology and increasingly on questions of ideology. Those are sort of hardwired differences in the relationship that have to do with interests and identity. And what I see is that we're in a period of greater divergence than convergence in our long-term interests. And you combine those structural differences with the fact that we have lots of issues to argue about, like Hong Kong right now, growing Chinese coercion over Taiwan, the South China Sea, and then, of course, technology policy, which seems to be in the news every day. So, as a Democrat that worked for President Obama, I'm deeply concerned about the trajectory of the relationship.
Thank you very much. Another question for you, and I'll turn it over to Ms. Ong, Professor Ong, afterwards, if I could. It's the same question. We do hear about the need for multilateral approaches to be taken here. And I think that's quite warranted. It's one thing to say that, though. I think the more important question is, what should a coalition of like-minded countries actually focus on? So, what areas, what specific actions are most likely to have an impact on the Chinese regime's actions? What are they most likely to listen to? What particular tools can this coalition look to put in place?
So my view is that it needs to be issue specific. You can't make an omnibus statement. That's generally not how international diplomacy works. So on the Hong Kong issue, the question is, what do you want to accomplish? Which countries' interests converge enough to put a coalition together? And I mentioned the 4 ones earlier. And then what can those 4 countries agree on in terms of practical steps, whether it's, naming and shaming, or actual sanctions, or opportunities like immigration and scholarships. So the way I see it is that it's very, very issue specific, and it's all about how do you accomplish, what are the steps that you can take to accomplish common goals? And I think we're already seeing this on Hong Kong, because the agreement to withdraw from extradition treaties, to cut down on law enforcement cooperation, and at least in the United States, there's debates about taking steps similar to the UK on immigration. Perhaps Canada is interested in doing the same.
Thank you very much. Professor Ong, I did say that I wanted to ask you that question, but Professor Medeiros put his finger on something there that he actually mentioned in his introduction, and I want to take it in a different direction, in fact, if I could. We've heard today at this committee, and we've heard in previous meetings, about the need for Canada to look to policies that would have our country provide or to continue to provide refuge to individuals fleeing persecution, in this case, Hong Kong. Your thoughts on that approach, expanding that, looking specifically at Hong Kong and the issues that a number of political activists continue to face there. Is this an effective way for Canada to exert some impact on the Hong Kong issue and to help Hong Kongers who are facing great difficulty?
Thank you for the question. It's an important one. In my view, the Battle of Hong Kong is not a short-term game. We need to have a long-term trajectory, and we need to be patient with it. So Canada, as a country that protects and preserves the liberal order, I think what we should be doing is to help to sustain the movement and the battle against a very huge and large authoritarian regime. So opening our doors to activists, for people who have suffered and fought in the battle, as well as the talent from Hong Kong, I think will go a long way in helping its fight in the medium to long run. And this is what we should be thinking about.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fragiskatos. Just a second, please. Et maintenant, pendant 6 minutes, Monsieur Bergeron.
And now, 6 minutes to you, Mr. Bergeron. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to our witnesses for appearing today and enlightening us with their remarks. I'd like to follow up on one of my colleagues' questions regarding the international coalition. Mr. Medeiros, you have said that it's incredibly important that Western democracies act together in order to influence Beijing's decisions. And you highlighted that the United States must absolutely participate in this coalition of like-minded Western countries. The United States, they take action against China. They're cold. What else, though? Sometimes sanctions are heavy, sometimes they're not. John Bolton, former national security advisor in the United States, recently revealed that Donald Trump had asked the Chinese authorities to help him be elected by buying products in certain key states for his election. Is it possible, in some circumstances, for us to create such a coalition of Western democracies with the United States and the people of Taiwan? Could they be used as a bargaining chip by the United States?
Excellent question, Mr. Bergeron. I'll take it in two parts. First, regarding U.S. policy, my view is that international coalitions are much more credible when a member of the coalition, like the United States, acts consistently. And one of my concerns about the Trump administration foreign policy is on this question of values and democracy promotion. They've been deeply, deeply inconsistent, which undermines American credibility and ultimately reduces the ability to forge coalitions, such as in the situations like Hong Kong, and then to be credible in the eyes of Beijing. So I hope the United States in the future, perhaps after the election, regardless of its results, America re-embraces democracy promotion, because it's only through America being credible that we can build these more consistently reliable coalitions on these kinds of issues. So regarding your question of Taiwan, the simple fact is Taiwan cannot and should not be a bargaining chip. It's not a very effective bargaining chip, and I think ultimately we would be betraying our commitments to our values and to the 24 million people who reside on Taiwan. Because ultimately, if we started treating Taiwan as a bargaining chip in the Canada-China or the U.S.-China relationship, all we really would be doing would be handing a substantial amount of leverage to Beijing and letting them know that we're indifferent about the future of Taiwan, which in my view is certainly not in American interest. So I think a question for you and other members of this special committee is, how do you want to deal with the question of Taiwan? Because I think Taiwan too often is treated as and seen as a pawn in the U.S.-China relationship, when in fact Taiwan should be treated in and of itself. And of course, America has a very special relationship with Taiwan. I understand that, and that's not necessarily applicable to your situation. But I think there are things that you can do, and perhaps you should do on the question of Taiwan, independent of the Canada-China relationship, that will then bolster your credibility in your dealings with the Chinese. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Medeiros. Rapidement.
Thank you, Mr. Medeiros. Quick question about sanctions. You co-wrote an article with Michael Green. In that article, you wrote that sanctions could hurt Hong Kong's economy more than Beijing's. And that idea of yours leads me to ask a question to Ms. Ong. Here's my question. You spoke about the fragile nature of Xi Jinping's power right now. Could international sanctions strengthen Xi Jinping's authority in China? Or could sanctions do the contrary? Could they undermine his credibility among his own people?
Important one. I think sanctions could produce implications that goes both ways. I would imagine that sanctions may be spinned by the regime to show up nationalism as spinned and framed as something as foreign sanctions versus China, and that would in turn help to bolster the regime. And I think sanctions in a way that helps that hurts Hong Kong, which in turn hurt the Beijing leadership, might actually not help us to achieve our objective at all.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ong. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Bergeron.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron.
Please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for your presentations. Dr. Medeiros, I'm interested in your comments on this matter. You talked about American foreign policy, and I just have before me an article from the weekend, over the weekend, talking about Secretary of State Pompeo's speech to the Czech Republic last week. And in his remarks, he talked about in the same speech saying that what's happening now isn't Cold War 2.0. He talked about the challenge of resisting the CPP threat is in some ways much more difficult. The CCP is engaged in enmeshing our economies, our politics, and our societies in ways the Soviet Union never was. And other references, all references apparently to China, were not to the People's Republic of China or to the government, but to the Communist Party. I'm wondering, in a speech about it's not a Cold War, isn't that language seems to me to be rather ideological in nature and not diplomatic, as it were, in terms of a strategic action by a state vis-a-vis another state. Is that language helpful, or are we talking about an ideological battle with the Communist Party as opposed to dealing with authoritarianism or anti-democratic activity, et cetera, et cetera? Could you comment on that, please?
Sure, Mr. Harris. The way I think about the U.S.-China relationship is there are four principal areas of strategic competition: security, economics, technology, and increasingly ideology. And the ideology dimension has come to the fore in recent years because of actions like the national security law in Hong Kong, but also because of the way in which the Chinese had been sort of promoting their view of political and economic governance abroad, which has raised a question and produced a debate in the United States about whether or not there is this sort of systemic competition of ideas between America and China, somewhat like the US and the Soviet Union. I myself have not come to the conclusion that it is existential for the United States that China represents the kind of threat that the Soviet Union did. I believe the Trump administration has come to that conclusion. They believe that China is trying to tear down the democratic world and replace it with sort of the China model, if in fact there is a China model. So I think we need to be aware of the differences in value. We shouldn't be pulling punches because there are big differences, and China engages in behavior that promotes its values. But the question is, do we really want to make it a Cold War? Because there are some huge differences between the previous Cold War and the emerging U.S.-China strategic, or I should say just the U.S.-China strategic competition. And I think what's important is to sort of put boundaries around the ideological dimension of the U.S.-China relationship in order to put it in the context of the other areas of strategic competition.
Harris,
I was concerned, Chair, about whether or not such a characterization and a Cold War talk is actually helpful to building coalitions, and that's my concern. Ms. Ong, or Professor Ong, you referred to the Chinese Communist Party in terms of this strategic interests of its leadership and the elite and how that would affect the kind of actions that are being taken, which I see that as a different thing. You have said in the past that in talking about working together with other countries, that the United States and Canada have different interests, it's not always the same interests, and we need to chart an independent course of foreign policy with China. We have shared interests, but there are areas where policies should diverge, particularly given Canada as a lesser power. I wonder, could you elaborate on that a little bit and perhaps describe some of those differences?
Right. I think, U.S.-China relations is a very different type of relationship than China's relations with other Western liberal nations. I think U.S. and China relations is that of a strategic competitor. I think the relationship between Canada and China are not necessarily that of a strategic competitor. U.S. sees China's rise in technological dominance and other sector as that of a rising competitor. Whereas I think for Canada, in some areas, there's more scope for collaboration. But in other areas, we should also be very mindful of the authoritarian nature of its political system and what that might do to Canadian interests. So I think the strategic calculation of that being a competitor, a collaborator, and in what sectors that sort of calculation should apply is very different from the United States and from Canada's perspective. And which is why I think, under the Trump administration, the sort of rhetoric is really not helping in putting together a united front, a concerted effort and push against China. If there's an outcome change in presidency in November, I think I'm more hopeful of an effective coalition against China. But a coalition, a Western coalition without the United States is actually it is doable, but not as effective.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. Now the 5-minute round. Ms. Alice-Libb for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. As each of you have pointed out, our ability to take appropriate action, both in terms of our own foreign policy and as members of the multinational community, is entirely dependent on the accuracy and of the information that we have with which to understand the situation and chart a path forward. Toward that end, Mr. Chung, you made some very important points around the threats to Canadian businesses operating in China, as well as the threats to Canadian citizens here on Canadian soil from various forms of influence and coercion from the People's Republic of China. So, as parliamentarians, it's our responsibility to be able to provide some information, advice, and a course of action. We need to put perhaps in place legislation that would mitigate or at least protect in some regard both Canadians on Canadian soil from the influence of the People's Republic of China, and to protect to some extent those Canadian businesses operating in China. Could you provide us with some recommendations, specifics on what type of legislation and what actions Canada could take to achieve those two very important goals?
Thank you. So in that connection, I would endorse some of the suggestions made by previous witnesses, in particular, the creation of a point person within the government to address issues regarding threats to Canadian businesses operating in China and Canadian citizens in Canada. And beyond that, the creation of a register of foreign lobbyists, not in the interests of inhibiting people from expressing what they like, but to make sure that people are properly informed as to who is saying what and for what reasons they might be doing so.
Could you cite any examples of those types of threats that you're aware of that have occurred to Canadian businesses in China? And would you have any idea of whether the situation is escalating or whether it is pretty much the same?
I cannot speak directly to what's happening with Canadian businesses in the mainland. As far as Hong Kong is concerned, I've seen reports thus far relating to the British financial institutions, HSBC and Standard Chartered. I would expect that similar pressure will be applied to Canadian institutions, although, again, I cannot speak with any certainty as to whether that has already happened.
You also mentioned about how important it is, obviously, for us to have accurate information, and that there's all kinds of pressures against those who would provide us with that accurate information to not do so because of the threats and consequences that they may face. So how do we know, and what can we do to ensure that we are getting the right information accurately and in timely, so that we can make appropriate and informed decisions?
Fundamentally, I think that a large part of the problem is that when people feel threatened, as the report that many other witnesses have referred to in the past in relation to harassment and intimidation of activists in Canada mentioned, when people are harassed, they try to get advice or help from one particular governmental department or bureau. They're sent to another and another and another until eventually they give up. There should be, ideally, a one-stop shop. So
an integrated approach, an integrated whole of government, not only with a point person, but coordinating between all of the departments so that we understand all the fronts that information is coming in and all the pressures from all corners that are being placed. Is that fair?
That would be a fair characterization, yes.
And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Aleslev. Now on to Ms. Zan for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. And actually, while we're speaking with Mr. Chung, I'd like to continue just asking him a couple of questions about his views on some of these issues. Back in April of this year, Mr. Chung, you stated on a show, writing in Just Security, you stated, on first observation, the decay of Hong Kong's autonomy has been abrupt. But in your view, however, recent events, you said, were long in the making, and you identified 3 factors that have contributed to the erosion of Hong Kong's autonomy. The Beijing and Hong Kong government's abuse of advocating independence as a political and legal cudgel, the growing role of the People's Republic of China Liaison Office, and the political capture of a previously professionalized civil service apparatus. Now, so what events, developments, and decisions would you say have led to the erosion of Hong Kong's autonomy since 1997? And what were the warning signs that perhaps the world has missed? And how did the international community, including Canada, respond? And how do we deal with this issue now? It's a bit of a long question, but
it's a complex set of questions with an equally complex set of answers. But to make a long story short, key events since 1997 would include the, I would say, abuse of the power to interpret the basic law that was vested in the National People's Congress Standing Committee. Since 1997, on only one occasion has that power been exercised at the request of a Hong Kong court. That should have been cause for alarm back in 1999 when the first interpretation was issued. It should have been cause for much more alarm in 2016 when it was used to preempt the decision of a Hong Kong court regarding the disqualification of legislators. And yet, well, not very much has been said on the occasion of each interpretation, and that has in part led us to where we are now. Other events would include, of course, the 2003 demonstrations, but also the Beijing government's subsequent reactions. I referred in that Just Security article to something that was written in the party journal Study Times by a liaison office official in 2008, referring to a second governance team. That warning was not taken seriously at the time, but as it turns out, having not been called out upon it, the liaison office has taken whatever opportunities it had to broaden its role. So in that sense, I would say there have been numerous warning signs, some of which I refer to there. The responses have, on the whole, from the international community, have on the whole not been terribly helpful. I don't think that any particular country has covered itself in glory, and the UK in particular, as the other signatory to the joint declaration, has done what the last Governor Patton referred to as the equivalent of writing reports that said rien when the Bastille was stormed. So what do we do now? We have to, I think it is incumbent upon the international community to say enough is enough. Any healthy relationship involves the setting of clear boundaries, and I think the time to do that with the PRC is long overdue.
Thank you. I don't know how much time we have left, but when did you see China becoming, rather than just being a communist regime, but becoming somewhat of a capitalist regime as well? It seems to be a mix now, and they are using both to compete in the world, but now also to control the people. When did you see all of that starting to change?
The PRC's transition to state capitalism has been happening for a very long time now, and I would argue that they have not been communist in the strict sense of the term for a very long time. As such, I am skeptical of the claim that they have an ideology beyond ethno-nationalism. And to that extent, I really don't think it should be construed as an ideological fight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Zan. And we'll now go to Mr. Williamson for 5 minutes. Mr. Williamson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just going to start my timer here as well. Thank you very much to our witnesses. You've presented a number of excellent points today and some good recommendations. Professor Ong, I'm curious to kind of get to some more of your thinking. You seem to be actually somewhat, at least partially, hopeful that there is an ability to reverse the takeover we're now seeing in Hong Kong. You said it will take time, but you seem to hold out that hope. So could you address that briefly? And in terms of viewing Hong Kong, if that's the case, should we think of Hong Kong, and I'm not so much kind of going back to the Cold War, but should we view Hong Kong as a Poland going forward? Kind of that resilience we all know is alive in Hong Kong in the people. Could you just comment on your reasons for hope?
Thank you for the question. My reason for hope is I think we want to preserve Hong Kong the way it is for as long as possible, because the rest of mainland China looks very different. The rest of mainland China operates within the Great Firewall. So we speak of repression in Hong Kong. It is nothing like the style and the extent of repression in mainland China. So as long as Hong Kong stays different, as illiberal as it is now, I think it will offer a beacon of hope as well as an example to the rest of mainland China. So in fact, when Sun Yat-sen first proposed the idea of a republican, he came up with that idea when he was in Hong Kong, because he saw the ways in which Hong Kong operated was very different from the rest of mainland China. And I also take the view that I think we should take a longer term view of history. No regime will last forever.
Okay,
the more repressive it is, the more long-lasting it will be.
So I think that's a good point. I'm going to turn now to Professor Medeiros. I take your point that what we're seeing in Hong Kong is not a prelude to war, and we have to be careful. Not only does Canada have 300,000 citizens in the territory, but there are millions of like-minded friends in Hong Kong, literally millions. And I think the talk of Cold War is overstated because of, as Mr. Chung just said, the ethno-nationalism we see on display in China. And in fact, I'm like your thoughts of should we think of what we're seeing in Asia now more akin to what we saw with respect to Imperial Japan, a nationalist population as well as a government, an expansionary state, and a military regime that does not have civilian oversight. And if that's the case, should the attention now not turn completely to Taiwan? Taiwan, the nation island, China wants it. They've long made this clear. And do we not need to stick together on this, particularly with the Taiwan Defense Act in the United States, that if this is not managed properly, unlike Hong Kong, this could lead to a real clash in the South China Sea? Could I get your comments on that? You have about a minute, just over a minute, I think, to respond.
Okay, I'll give you my lightning response. So first and foremost, yes, we need to stick together on this question of how to address the China challenge in East Asia, and especially when it comes to Taiwan. I think there's some useful, interesting analogies between China today and the Japanese military and Japanese militarization. But keep in mind that the PLA, the Chinese military, is a party-run army. Mm-hmm. And so there actually is quite a bit more sort of civilian control over it per se. And I think Xi Jinping, through his anti-corruption campaign, has been able to reestablish a lot of authority. China as an economy is a lot more globally integrated than Japan was. But nonetheless, the nationalist component of it, the fact that the military is more capable, gives me a lot of concern. And that's why I think thinking about a China strategy as a series of coalitions of the willing to address specific issues with like-minded partners is perhaps the best way to approach different and unique challenges going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Williamson. Ms. Yip, for 5 minutes, please.
This question is directed to Professor Ong. We have heard from you that the Hong Kong stock market is the best way to raise capital, and that also 4 out of 10 companies are planning to leave their headquarters to go elsewhere. How dependent is China on Hong Kong as a financial hub?
Quite dependent, but they are not without options. My point is, I think we want to keep dependency of Chinese capitalism on Hong Kong going, because as long as they are dependent on Hong Kong, they won't impose harsher repression on Hong Kong that we have seen elsewhere in China, such as in Xinjiang and Tibet. But I think moving forward, what we are likely to see in Hong Kong's financial sector and business sector is a bit of a bifurcation. So we have this emergence of underwriting and prominence of Chinese companies in Hong Kong on the one hand, and withdrawal of Western firms, particularly US firms on the other hand. But mind you that Chinese companies are there because they have ready access to US dollars and all the convenience of Hong Kong. So if we take that away by using sanctions or whatever other punitive means, we punish Hong Kong, we might in turn punish Chinese companies. I think that would in turn push the Chinese government to explore other options for doing business with the rest of the world, keeping Hong Kong out of the equations. And I think that would be bad for Hong Kong.
How can Canada help the businesses, the Canadian businesses there?
I think we should just keep doing business in Hong Kong the way it is. Of course, there are a lot more restrictions now than it was a couple of months ago. But I think business goes on as usual, and I think we should also keep on doing business with China. It is only by maintaining the ties, engagement with certain qualifications that we can keep the hope going.
Is there any way that the international financial community could bring some pressure to bear, further pressure?
I think in the short run, businesses tend to be directed by where their interest lies, where the profit lies. But I do believe that in the medium and long term, if governments guide the businesses rightly, if we designed, suitable institutional design that would actually guide the incentives of businesses, we can help to steer the businesses away from authoritarian regime. We could impose certain sort of, by imposing labor qualifications, by imposing certain standards on businesses that they have to meet. I think we can slowly guide the business away from authoritarian regime.
Well, that sounds hopeful. My next question is directed to Professor Medeiros. If you were asked to predict how U.S.-Canada or U.S.-China relations might change under the Trump's administration to possibly President Joe Biden come November, what would you say, and how will Canada benefit?
So it's hard to predict what the changes will be. I worked very closely with Vice President Biden, including the very initial steps to build the relationship between Vice President Xi Jinping and Vice President Biden from the White House in 2011. So I saw how Vice President Biden sort of thinks about China. What I would imagine is the first thing to change would be the tone. Dropping the overtly confrontational Cold War-like rhetoric and getting back to the business of strategic competition. And I think that frame of strategic competition would likely continue. It would probably be focused much more on improving America's own strength and its abilities to ensure America runs faster. But nonetheless, strategic competition would continue to be the frame. I think Vice President Biden would also look to do a lot more with allies, reinvesting, reconceptualizing alliances, and working more multilaterally. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Ms. Yip. Merci beaucoup, Ms. Yip. Monsieur Bergeron, 2 minutes 30 secondes.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yip. Monsieur Bergeron. Very quickly, thank you, Mr. Chair. We've heard Mr. Medeiros and Ms. Ong's perspectives on the possible effects of sanctions in response to the adoption of the national security law. Since we will have to make proposals to the federal government of Canada, I'd like to have Mr. Chong's opinion on the usefulness of such sanctions and the nature of the sanctions that should be implemented to have positive effects on China.
Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Seen so far with the US-imposed Magnitsky-style sanctions on designated Hong Kong and mainland officials is that they are having an effect, that financial institutions, including PRC's state-owned financial institutions, are scrambling to comply with them. And in the event that Canada were to consider imposing sanctions, ideally in conjunction with like-minded countries, Magnitsky-style targeted sanctions directed at people who have planned or instigated atrocities and human rights violations in Hong Kong would stand the best chance of not affecting the general Hong Kong population.
J'aimerais voir si Monsieur Medeiros.
I'd like to know if Ms. Ong or Mr. Medeiros would like to react to this intervention by Mr. Chong. So
if I could intervene for a second, I agree with Professor Chung on his point. I would just like to add that I think the Magnitsky Act will impose inconvenience on Hong Kong officials. But I have no doubt in my mind that where their loyalty lies, where their political loyalty lies. But having said that, I think sanctions also serve important signaling purposes. I think the importance of signaling should not be overlooked, but the actual impact could be rather limited because short-term inconvenience could often be overcome by some creative measures.
Sorry, Mr. Harris, 2 minutes, 30 seconds.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Ong, you talked about how we deal with the financial aspects of Hong Kong. And as I see it, China wants to show that it can repress the people of Hong Kong with the security law and still obtain the benefits of the financial advantages of having Hong Kong in place. And it's a bit of a tightrope to me. How do we move China towards a rules-based system while keeping Hong Kong in the same situation as it is? I take it you see what the U.S. is doing by erasing the difference between financial measures towards Hong Kong businesses versus mainland is not effective. But what would be effective in terms of moving the dial towards the expectation that China should, in fact, follow these rules, or is that a long-term strategic thing rather than a short-term one?
I see this as a long-term strategy that we should really be working with like-minded countries and our allies, including the United States, ideally, to come up with long-term strategies that would help to bring about some long-term changes. So I do believe that the fate of Hong Kong, including what the people on the streets of Hong Kong are asking for, universal suffrage or freedom of expression, it's not the question of Hong Kong alone. It is also a question about Beijing. It's really a question about the government in mainland China. I think the two questions are inherently intertwined.
I wonder quickly that Dr. Medeiros, could you comment on that in terms of long and short term?
Well, I think we have to be mindful that our leverage on the Hong Kong question is generally very, very limited because the geographic proximity, the size of China's economy vis-a-vis Hong Kong, et cetera. So as I said, I think we have to play the long game. I think we have to have modest expectations. And we have to come up with sort of creative approaches, which means creative approaches that don't exist yet with the international business community, especially international finance, including banks in Canada, and then think about issue-specific coalitions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. Thank you. And this concludes our first panel. I want, on behalf of the committee, thank you very much. We very deeply appreciate your time today, and I'm sure we're all sorry for having kept you waiting as we dealt with some important business of the committee. The committee will now pause and will suspend while we arrange for the next panel. So please be ready in 4 or 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Merci. Merci beaucoup.
colleagues and our witnesses. I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of the new witnesses. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. When you are ready to speak, you can click on the microphone icon to activate your mic. I should say, however, that once we get into the questions from members, members will indicate who they wish to answer their question, and you won't have to wait for me to call upon you as they go to you. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. Interpretation in this video conference will work very much like in a regular committee meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. As you are speaking, if you plan to alternate from one language to the other, you will need to also switch the interpretation channel so it aligns with the language you are speaking. You may want to allow for a short pause when switching languages. A reminder to witnesses that if you require French interpretation, you should be selecting your English channel on the bottom of your screen, and vice versa if you need English interpretation. When you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. The use of headsets is strongly encouraged. I would now like to welcome our second panel of witnesses. As an individual, Stéphane Chatagnier, lawyer. On behalf of Human Rights in China, Sharon Hom, Executive Director. From the University of Surrey, Malt Philip Kading, Assistant Professor in International Politics. Forgive me, please, for any errors in pronunciation. We'll begin. On va commencer avec...
We will start with Mr.
So we'll start with Mr.
For 10 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the Special Committee for hearing from me today concerning China-Canada relations and the current situation in Hong Kong. I have been a lawyer since 1992, and I had the unique experience of living in China and Hong Kong for 10 years, from 2008 to 2017. My professional practice has focused on economic immigration to Canada, and more specifically on the Government of Quebec's Immigrant Investor Program. I have assisted over 2,000 individuals who applied to this program, mainly owners and leaders of private companies established in mainland China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. They told me how they became rich within or on the periphery of this China, which in less than 30 years has reached the status of the second largest world economy, and it now rivals the North America and the European Union in a number of industrial sectors. Throughout these years, I lived without fear of the state in Hong Kong, this democracy of 7.5 million people. I also moved freely without any fear of the state in Taiwan, another Asian democracy of 23 million inhabitants. The contemporary history of Hong Kong and Taiwan reveals just how courageous and determined their peoples are. Like us, they want to freely elect their government and continue to live in an environment that is transparent and predictable, which bears the values, freedoms, and democratic guarantees stipulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Hong Kong Constitution. As a number of witnesses highlighted last week, the ties between Hong Kong and Canada are close, and the current crisis requires attention and firm and coordinated action from the Canadian government. Living in Hong Kong is being part of the corrosive perimeter of an authoritarian regime and a government system that is in complete opposition with the democratic values that each Canadian lawyer defends. After each visit to mainland China, I returned to Hong Kong breathing more freely, feeling safe in a social environment. After spending time with people who were policed, indoctrinated, neutralized and for whom the Communist Party of China was limited their life to purely economic existence. But the Hong Kong National Security Law, passed in July 2020, extends this lack of freedoms to the democracy of Hong Kong. It takes into account web comments. This national security law extends the atmosphere of mainland China to Hong Kong. It is applying its ecosystem of hyper-surveillance and repression, which well before July 2047 in violation of the Sino-British Joint Declaration signed in 1984. This ecosystem produces self-censorship, a protective mechanism that is profoundly anchored in mainland Chinese people. Even more so, informing on others is encouraged and even organized. The NSL is a true Trojan horse in the Hong Kong legal system, and it has already produced a self-censoring among Hong Kongers. Suddenly, individuals and organizations are closing their social media accounts, withdrawing their yellow squares and books that could offend. The law fosters a fear of the state that did not exist before. Ultimately, the communist regime will confine Hong Kong's to a life that is limited to purely economic existence. This summer, I read an edition of Foreign Affairs from February 2008, which was called Changing China. It makes me smile a bit 12 years later. Hoping to change China is feeding hope to bringing the leadership class to reforming political and economic governance, to respect the rule of law, human rights, and commercial liberalization. The proof of the facts of the last 20 years reveals a lot of naivety. The instincts of the Government of Canada and companies and research and teaching establishments are sometimes frustrating. From my first years in China, I hoped for statements like that made by French President Emmanuel Macron made in March 2019, who said, "The time for European naivety is over in relations with China." Western sympathy and engagement to China, which has continued despite its repressive and predatory regime, has not converted into confidence. On the contrary, the people have been deprived of a more fertile relationship. Since 2014, President Xi Jinping has ordered his population to follow the Chinese dream of the great revitalization of the Chinese nation. The legitimacy and sincerity of this call seem difficult to contest for this country long time called the sick man of Asia. However, the current propaganda leads to nearly fanatic xenophobia, nationalist sentiments in a society deprived of reliable and critical information. Furthermore, this information finds fertile ground in a national education that emphasizes the 100 years of humiliation of China in the hands of foreign powers. It is necessary for Canada to take for granted that the Chinese regime, in its pursuit of socialism with Chinese characteristics, is radically opposed to a number of Western values. In September 2013, the magazine Minjing, based in the United States, published a document destined for the 18th Congress of the Convention of the Chinese Communist Party, entitled Communique on the Current State of the Ideological Sphere, a notice from the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China's General Office. The document highlighted the ideological fight and stated a number of cautions about trends, activities, and wrongful ideological positions, such as promotion of constitutional Western democracies, universal values, civil society, neoliberalism, and the Western definition of journalism. It seems unrealistic to believe that China will change in the direction that we want it to. In the 21st century, the risk is rather that the communist regime will change us in ways we do not want. It is extremely important for Canada to ensure that our relationship with this country, which has become quite preeminent in an international order, does not lead us to relativize and attenuate the importance of our values, standards, and interests. In its relationship with Canada, the Chinese regime applies a holistic approach in a number of aspects of which can serve as pressure points on Canada, including those that are outside of international standards, such as the detention of Kevin and Julia Garrett in 2014 and Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor in 2018. Each silence, omission to act, or compromise of our values, norms, or interests feeds the regime's comfort in this practice of intimidation. It is necessary. The Government of Canada must deny China the desired effect, self-censorship and good behavior. With our allies, we must develop and support vigilance and international action that is disciplinary, interdepartmental, consistently better coordinated concerning the behavior of the Chinese regime, particularly concerning human rights, interference in foreign political life, intimidation on foreign soil, erosion of civil and political rights in Hong Kong and Taiwan, theft of intellectual property, industrial espionage, artificial intelligence, educational, scientific, and commercial partnerships that threaten the autonomy, security, and economic interests of Canada. This vigilance will allow Canada to establish a foreign, commercial, and national security policy towards China that is more faithful to the realities and identity of the 37 million Canadians, including the 300,000 who live in Hong Kong. Let's ensure that China does not change us. Thank you.
And now we'll go to Ms. Hom for 10 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to testify before the committee. It's really an honor and a challenge to follow the witnesses who have offered such powerful expert views last week and this morning, and in particular highlighting the ongoing critical developments in Hong Kong that will impact on Canadians at home and in Hong Kong. I think COVID-19 has made it quite clear that the impacts on health and stability of the world in the region will not stay within its borders. I am a Hong Konger by birth and a holder of a permanent Hong Kong residency. And I'm also professor of law emerita at the City University of New York School of Law. I taught law for 18 years, including training Chinese lawyers, judges, law teachers, and legal cadres over the course of 10 years, beginning in the late 1980s. My organization, Human Rights in China, was formed in March 1989 to support the 1989 democracy movement. And within an international human rights frame, we support human rights defenders, civil society groups to advance human rights protections. We have had a presence in Hong Kong since 1996. The last time I was in Ottawa was in 2012 for the World Parliamentarians for Tibet conference. And Ms. Zan's question this morning about warning signs triggered that for me, and that in fact, Beijing's policies, militarization and comprehensive securitization, including in national security laws, and the tactics of social repression and control were deployed decades ago and signaled clearly the writing on the wall for Hong Kong if there were political will to read it. I want to begin with an overarching point, and then I will proceed to making a few pickup comments on the national security law to tunnel down, and then I would like to jump to recommendations and hope that through the questions we can have more detailed discussion. So my overarching point is that it's very important for this committee in the report or whatever concrete product comes out of these set of hearings that you pay attention to the control of the narrative, because the Hong Kong, headlines that are declaring the death of Hong Kong, the end of Hong Kong as we know it, one country, no future, so on. These are indeed dire descriptions grounded in sobering daily evidence of the onslaught on the rule of law, the values, the way of life, and has indeed resulted in censorship, chilled atmosphere, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to urge all of us in talking about Hong Kong, caution in repeating or highlighting these partial narratives of hopelessness, especially one that is prematurely declaring a future not yet written. And it's important for the public conversation in Canada and in the recommendations for the government that although the right to peaceful assembly has been almost gutted in Hong Kong, Hong Kongers are not silent and have not given up on hope. You can see the front page of the Apple Daily for the new Lenin Wall. Hong Kongers online are saying, we are still alive. Stop declaring us dead. We need solidarity and concrete support, not funeral dirges. And the answer to Mr. Williams' question, is there reason for hope, was best answered by this activist. It's not that we have lost. It's that we just have not yet won, recognizing the long road ahead. So let's not consciously or unconsciously adopt official Beijing narratives that contribute to the work of the official propaganda outlets. So I want to take, there's been a lot of reference and discussion to the national security law, and the general critiques have been extensively discussed, and how it's contributing to the ecosystem and how it's importing it into Hong Kong from the mainland. But I want to add a couple of quick points. One point is that the new Office for Safeguarding National Security, the OSNS, that is made up of personnel sent by the mainland to supervise all the national security work. They are not only not subject to Hong Kong jurisdiction, they hold an ID document of certification issued by the office, and any vehicle used by the holder are not subject to inspection, search, or detention by Hong Kong law enforcement officers. The incident just a few days ago by Ted Hui, a Hong Kong legislator who was being followed for days as other legislators by unmarked or marked dark cars, people in cars. He went to try to ask, who are you and why are you following me? The car hit him and he called the police. The police arrived and they tackled Ted Hui, the legislator, to the ground, and they escorted the car, of which they did not stop for any questions, away. So this is really very concerning. The other requirement that I want to highlight that hasn't been highlighted is that the heads of the new departments of national security in the Hong Kong police must swear allegiance and to observe the obligation of secrecy. This is not very good for transparency and to address impunity and the good governance that's required for the business community, for the protection of Canadian citizens, for the protections of all persons in Hong Kong. Finally, we are really seeing under the implementing regulations for Article 43 that an already unaccountable Hong Kong police force is now been strengthened in the ways in which it can carry out its arrests. And the extraterritoriality, I'll say that in a minute. So I think that Canadians and this committee will fully appreciate the problems of translation. So the national security law in Hong Kong is the only law in Hong Kong SAR that only has the Chinese version as the legally authoritative version. But however, if you look carefully at the English quote translation on the Hong Kong SAR government, there are errors, omissions, and misleading translations into the English. For example, Article 1 in Chinese, after listing the kinds of problems that's addressed by the law, has the Chinese term dang. Dang is not in the English. What is dang? It means an other. In other words, it's not a comprehensive list of what is being targeted by the law. Also, in other provisions, gongtong, joint liability, not in the English. Also, in Article 9 and 10, universities does not exist in the Chinese. It has hao, schools. And that is a problem because of the whole academic freedom debate now. How and in what ways does the law apply to higher education institutions? The other one that's misleading is that in Chinese, Hong Kong Tongbao is translated as Hong Kong people. That is not Hong Kong people. Hong Kong Tongbao is Hong Kong compatriots carrying all the resonances of the party. On the implementation concerns, as I'm running out of time, I want to say just quickly, it is as if the rush to pass this law through, that they took off in a plane and now they don't know how to land. So many of the procedural and substantive issues, which I hope you can ask questions about, were not thought through or addressed. And one of them, for example, is that we have a civil law system on the mainland predominantly, a common law system in Hong Kong, but it is trying to now merge under Article 55 jurisdiction for cases that will be tried on the mainland with a legalistic and described by China expert Barmé, fascistic Stalinist system. So even the Supreme Court of Canada ensures that your judges have expertise in both civil and common law, and none of that exists. Because I am out of time, let me jump to recommendations. I have 5 recommendations for the committee to consider and for the government. First, all of the recommendations, working multilaterally, joint sanctions, targeting sanctions, safe haven, etc., those are extremely important, have been repeated very powerfully. I have one national suggestion regarding the Confucius Institute, and that recognizing that there are controversies, and I don't want to jump into domestic controversies, you may consider whether you want to adopt the Swedish approach, close them all. Or do you want to adopt the U.S. approach, which is to designate them as foreign missions? This would send a message that's consistent with Canadian values and your commitment to freedom of expression. On the, we are out of time. Four recommendations on using international human rights norms, institutions, and values. This is Mr. Harris's question. How do we move China towards a more rule-based system? Yes, it's long-term, but there are immediate opportunities. One is that the ICCPR, the national security law, is the only mainland law that explicitly incorporates the ICCPR into the law. And that is, if we take Article 4 seriously, we should look at opportunities and the list of issues that has been issued by the Standing Committee as normative international concerns that Canadian government can use. There's the Human Rights Council election. China is running. You should take a position on that. And then to use more extensively the existing platforms, Interparliamentary Union, and the IPAC, of course. And I'm sorry, I'm out of time, but hopefully, please ask me questions about all the things I was not able to get to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hom. And now we'll hear from Professor Kading, please, for 10 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much. It's a great honor and privilege to have this opportunity to testify at this important and very timely hearing. And I thank the committee very much for inviting me. I've conducted research on Hong Kong for almost 20 years now. And in recent years, I researched what we call localism and the independence movement. And I will use a political psychology approach here to outline how recent events in Hong Kong really question the existing perception, or as Ms. Hom mentioned, a narrative about China. And I think this helps to establish a new narrative of China-Canada relation, which facilitates all the actions for Canada in terms of diplomacy, sanctions, and refugees, which my esteemed colleagues have already outlined in detail during the past hearings. We know already that the PRC does not cannot be trusted in keeping its international commitment. It uses its own narrative to devalue treaties and international institutions. And Beijing, as you have heard, already began as early as 1997 with this in Hong Kong, establishing elected councils, changing the electoral system, and derailing democratization by imposing Chinese-style democracy. So after the 2014 umbrella movement, there was actually no real hope for democratic reforms as promised in the Basic Law. So the question is now, of course, why this heavy-handed introduction of the national security, and why all these arrests, disqualification, postponement of the legislative elections? And I argue that the actions of Beijing's regime are actually driven by fear. So the arrest of Jimmy Lai, Agnes Chow, the raiding of Apple Daily, arrest of the group of teenagers just debating independence, they all should, of course, intimidate Hong Kongers. But also, at the same time, they show the domestic Chinese audience that the regime is very tough on these so-called separatists colluding with foreign forces. So we have to understand that the regime in Beijing rules by fear, but is also ruled by fear itself. So fears of the cracks in its ruling elite, fear of economic downturn, and fear of growing dissatisfaction with its own in its own population. So that's why, despite disqualifying opposition candidates for the Legislative Council elections, the Hong Kong government still postponed the election. This is just because Beijing was afraid that it would be unable to bust thousands of pro-Beijing supporters from the mainland who are still registered voters in Hong Kong. Because the pro-Beijing government heavily relies on the allocation of these votes, because without them, it cannot guarantee the output, the outcome of complete control in Hong Kong. Even worse, it cannot communicate the outcomes to its Chinese citizens. So we know that Xi has to be very tough on Beijing because Beijing has been completely surprised by the anti-extradition movement last year, and it fears most the protesters' radical tactics and attitudes. And the protest repertoire, including the main slogan, has been inspired by this so-called localist movement I want to talk a little bit about. So the localists, they want to protect Hong Kong's democratic values and unique cultural identity. And in the early to mid-2010s, they saw China as breaking all its promises and undermining one country to systems framework more and more blatantly. And so the localists are really among the first to question the relationship with China and verbalize their distrust of Beijing and its promises. So some call for a referendum of Hong Kong's future and some call for Hong Kong independence. And I did a lot of very secretive interviews with the entire leadership and a lot of followers of these localists. And a lot of them, of course, identify them themselves as solely as Hong Kongers and not as Chinese. But the most important part is that they are not afraid to pay an extremely high personal price for the protection of Hong Kong. So after the success of the localists in the 2016 Legislative Council elections, they were driven, a lot of them were driven into bankruptcy, in exile, and sentenced to long prison terms. You may have heard about Edward Leung still serving a 6-year prison term. So the suppression of the localists really intensified the hopelessness in the society, as Hom already mentioned this sentiment. But localists offered Hong Kong independence as a kind of hope for their own supporters. So this allows them to cope with the negative emotions experienced through Chinese pressure. So this initially very far-fetched idea of Hong Kong independence is now uniting the younger generation after a crackdown on the current movement. So in other words, Hong Kong independence is a psychological coping mechanism which results from the repression by the Hong Kong and Beijing governments. And the second thing I want to highlight about the current movement, does it replicate some of the ideas and repertoire from these localists. And one key element is this idea of self-sacrifice, or what they talk about, this burnism or mutual destruction. So meaning that if I have to burn, you have to burn with me. So and this identifies really that many of the mainland Chinese in Hong Kong use, so it could be cadres, businessmen, middle-class families, use Hong Kong for their own private security, getting a different passport, parking their assets overseas. Because of the permanent uncertainties of the Chinese systems, you're never safe when you're inside China, no matter what you're doing. So at the heart of Burnism is really the rejection of the CCP's instrumental approach to the Hong Kong liberal system. So the idea of mutual destruction transforms the fear of the Hong Kong people of authoritarian erosion into a concrete fear for the Chinese elite. First of all, by creating an unpredictable economic and political situation in Hong Kong through protests and so forth. And secondly, by denying Hong Kong as a safe haven through international sanctions is triggered. So as you remember, there was very little reaction when China was criticized for its treatment of the Uyghurs. So China didn't do very much when it was criticized. But once Hong Kong was targeted, the Xi administration went so far as to implement this national security law with all this extraterritorial scope, and you can argue even it legalizes hostage diplomacy. Yeah. So the overreaction we see does confirm, I think, China's fear. So I want to conclude here, what does it mean for Canada? With Hong Kong and the US closing doors for its ruling elite, Canada might be a target destination. So if this is not addressed, then Canada's democratic system will be quickly confronted with authoritarian erosions and the CCP's political mobilization, like what happened in Hong Kong. So I think Canada should be aware of the fears of the Chinese regime. So this is about the narrative Ms. Hom mentioned. So if we see that China itself is actually afraid, then don't see the Chinese regime as almighty, and there are actually many potential cracks in the ruling coalition. This new narrative would be a good basis to work in alliance with like-minded countries to speak up and limit the undermining of democratic and open institutions by authoritarian regimes. And I think with Canada's strong legacy of creative and very effective diplomacy, I'm very confident that Canada has the responsibilities and means to protect Hong Kong people and our all shared faith in democracy. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I'm looking forward to answering any questions.
Thank you very much, Professor. We will now go to the first round of questions. Leading off for 6 minutes, Mr. Williamson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses. Thank you for joining us today. You've all added some really solid and good information as well as insights. I'll start with Ms. Sharon. First of all, thank you for stiffening my spine. Sometimes my questions are rhetorical, but it is good. It's always good to hear the reasons for hope, and the reasons why we need to do more, not less, for the people of Hong Kong, while we also consider how best to help our friends in neighboring Taiwan. I thought earlier today, Professor Ong had a really good point about Hong Kong still being the golden goose for mainland officials and for the country, because this will give. This means the territory is not going to suddenly or quickly or even perhaps gradually become just another Chinese city because of the wealth and prosperity that would be lost. This will benefit both dissidents and activists in Hong Kong to continue pushing for to continue their push for their struggle for freedom and human rights. You asked for a few minutes. If you could maybe give us 90 seconds, all the things you wanted to say but didn't have a chance. But I will cut you off after 90 seconds because I too am on the clock and the mindful eye of our own big brother here.
Okay, thank you. I won't say everything I can say, but listen, thank you so much for that question. Hong Kong is indeed the golden goose, but Beijing does not keep that golden goose on a free-range farm. That's number one. Unless the renminbi replaces the US dollar as the major currency in global settlement, Hong Kong will continue to be important. So not only for the fact that the Hong Kong people will resist to the end, that they will not ever be another Chinese city, that's the important. The other thing I wanted to add this morning quickly was that what is good for Canadian business, or what is good for all business, is you need a rule of law. You need information. The market can't function without information. And when you have vetted information, controlled information, censored media, you don't have a real competitive marketplace. So I think we should emphasize that it's not only for human rights people that we need transparency, accurate information, and rule of law and independent courts. It's important for all the stakeholders in Hong Kong. I wanted to say, I'm glad we want to stiffen your spine, and we say, and I believe this is also rapidly becoming censored. Ga yao, add oil, just keep going. This is very important. You also, Mr. Harris asked this morning if I can also, that how do we move
I'm going to cut you off in 15 seconds, so yeah, but go ahead.
System. Yeah. And how do we get China to be more moving where we want it to go? I think the question is not where do we want it to go? How do we support Hong Kong people to get the Hong Kong government to be where we want it to go? It's not where the U.S. and the West or the multilaterals want. It's what we want. And I think that's the question.
Thank you. Professor Kading, your insight I thought was unique. Actually, you provided I think a possible glimpse into the thinking of mainland officials. But the point you made that Beijing cannot be that Beijing cannot be trusted has some serious implications, because if a partner cannot be trusted, that means they have to be dealt with as untrustworthy. What then should Canada's policy be? Should it be then to continue trading, to have commercial relations with both mainland China and Hong Kong, but also to have the internal fortitude to denounce and to speak out when Beijing is out of step, something that unfortunately we're not seeing now? Is it this combination of trade, because that is mutually beneficial to both parties, but also speak out, to find our voice in Canada, and to perhaps follow in the footsteps of Australia and some of the other Asian nations that are closer to mainland China? What say you to that?
Thank you so much. Mr. Williamson, yeah, I agree with you that this we can't go back what is now called this new Cold War, so that we completely shut ourselves out. But I think it's very important to speak out. It's very, very important to speak out and do this, as many of my colleagues mentioned, do this in alliance with others, so that there is this collaboration, there's this acknowledging that we have to speak together, the free countries, or as it says, with the European Union, with the US, New Zealand, Australia, to highlight when China moves beyond what is acceptable in the international rules-based society. And just be aware that institutions can be amended through interpretation by the Chinese.
And that will, of course, mean that when you speak out, there might be some blowback on commercial relations, but that's just the price for standing up. Et finalement, Mr. Chattigny.
Mr. Chattigny, finally, did I understand you well when you said that there are many things that Canada and our allies can do to change Beijing's perspectives? Thank you for your question. I think that our allies can collectively change China. One of the premises of my message was we need to avoid China from changing us, but can we still change China? If we want to do so, we need to stop being naive. Thank you, Mr. Williamson. Thank you, Mr. Chattigny. Mr. Oliphant for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And before I follow up on Mr. Williamson's questions, which I thought were really very, very fine questions, just a couple of quick things. Ms. Om, I'm wondering if we could, I would appreciate something in writing from you with respect to some of your legal analysis, translation issues, etc. I think if you would be willing to do that, the committee could really benefit from your legal mind on this. It's something a little bit different. We've had some generic comments on the law, but you were getting specific, and we don't have time here to do that. So I just want to request that through the chair, that may be helpful if you're willing. I'll just keep it in English, sorry. Mr. Chattigny, again, I would like to plumb the depths of your immigration knowledge. And if you have some specific immigration suggestions for us vis-a-vis this new context with Hong Kong, I think we'd also very much appreciate your expertise at the committee. So I just wanted to, if you're willing to get us anything in writing, even a letter of some of your key points on immigration, I think that could be helpful for us. Following up on Mr. Williamson's very good questions, the other half of the golden goose, the goose with the golden eggs, was that we were challenged to find a way that strongly condemns the actions of Beijing on Hong Kong. We have to find a way to do that with impact, yet that impact, we've heard before today that impact, obviously needs to be targeted and can't hurt the people of Hong Kong. But Professor Ong this morning suggested that, in fact, if we went too far on that, we could actually ruin Hong Kong's advantages for Beijing to want to keep it successful. So I just would like your comments, Ms. Hom, on that, and maybe Mr. Keating's as well, if we could do that.
Thank you. Human rights in China is, in fact, we've released on July 5th a bilingual annotated version with initial comments on the law. We can send you that. We are now preparing an updated annotation on surfacing all of the translation problems with comments. And we'll be happy to send you that as well, because we think the devil is in the details, particularly if you're being prosecuted under the law. The high level stuff is not going to help. And for policymakers, you really need to get into the weeds. Secondly, on the response, targeted sanctions. It is important that you know that when we say targeted, one thing on Magnitsky-type sanctions is that Hong Kong groups, Hong Kong people, Hong Kong researchers have created massive databases and have issued reports that have listed and named individuals, in particular, including the United Front, which was kind of more shadow than the last 5 years. And I think I would urge the committee to look at some of those reports. We can send you some citations, but the annex is very interesting because individuals are listed. And I think that when we think of targeted sanctions, it should be targeting individuals who have taken both leadership role as well as the lead role in implementing the propaganda, in implementing the pressure, the intimidation, the surveillance of Canadians, of ethnic Chinese, not just in Canada. We know what that has been. This is not a new phenomenon for us or for myself personally.
Thank
so
you.
I think that would be helpful.
Okay, I'm just going to cut you off there. Thank you. Mr. Keating, you can comment on that as well if you'd like. I have a good answer, but I have another question for you as well. So if you could be short, any comments you have on that one?
Just very briefly, I completely agree with Professor Hom that individual targeted, wide-reaching, so a lot of the more people, the better. So I disagree with Professor Ong that this will be detrimental to Hong Kong's economy.
Based on what evidence?
That is exactly what the movement tries to achieve, right? Because we will not target the normal banking operations. We will target Red Capital, we'll target United Front people.
For sure. Thank you. So the main question I have for you has to do with how homogenous is are the movement or is the movement in Hong Kong, which you have talked about as localism. When I have looked at the world, any kind of movement around anything, there are usually people with different goals, but they coalesce around a movement to get their different goals. How homogenous is the Hong Kong movement? And what are the divisions?
Right. So very briefly, the localist movement is one part of the anti-extradition movement. So as I tried to say that it has inspired a large part of the last year's movement, but the localist movement is not the same. Inside the localist movement, you have a spectrum of people wanting a referendum, people wanting to go independent. Some people just want to go back 10 years. Yeah, the movement last year is very it's surprisingly homogeneous on the key main goals, these 5 demands we have heard quite a lot about.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oliphant. Et maintenant, Monsieur Bergeron pendant 6 minutes.
And now, 6 minutes to Mr. Bergeron. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would like to thank our witnesses for their incredibly relevant comments. The witnesses are helping us to reflect on the situation in China and especially in Hong Kong. I would like to ask Mr. Chatigny for some insight. He is very experienced in the domain of immigration. After the events at Tiananmen Square, Canada helped greatly to get some activists out of China. But there are issues now with immigration, notably the pandemic. The pandemic has made it such that Canada's immigration activities, for example, granting visas, these activities have been suspended for the most part. Chinese authorities have also threatened to forbid activists from leaving. And there's another challenge. Not all residents of Hong Kong have the financial means to leave Hong Kong and emigrate to Canada. So, in your experience, what should we keep in mind? What do you suggest to the Government of Canada in order to get activists out of Hong Kong, given the obstacles I've just listed? Thank you for your question, Mr. Bergeron. My expertise when it comes to immigration, as I said during my remarks, is mostly with the Immigrant Investor Program in Quebec. In the first part of your question, you mentioned the pandemic shutting down many immigration programs. That is a broad reality that affects all programs. I don't have any specific recommendations to that effect. When it comes to immigration, the Department of Immigration has specific powers. I think what's most important is to act swiftly and immediately. Thank you, Mr. Chattigny. Now, let's come back to what Mr. Keating was saying. The Chinese government intervened in Hong Kong by imposing its national security law. What led to that? It seems that China had many fears and worries. China was afraid of the independentist movement. And the Chinese government, so to speak, fueled the desire for independence in Hong Kong, especially among young people. Is that what you said? Did I understand correctly?
This is my main argument, that because of the ongoing suppression going on for a couple of years now, that the localist movement created the idea of independence as a hope to cling on to, as a psychological coping mechanism. So now pressuring more through the national security law, through the clampdown last year, will only fuel this independence movement.
Je dois admettre que votre...
Your argument is really refreshing. We often face a challenge. That is, that China is increasingly a global superpower, and often we feel as if we can't take any action against China, but you have hit on something very important: fear, and the vulnerability that lies behind fear. And that's what we can act on. That's our leeway. You mentioned a survey which sounded very interesting. According to the survey, a majority of Hong Kong residents identify first as Hong Kong residents and then as Chinese. And that speaks to me, because the people of Hong Kong have a rich and storied past. What does this mean, these survey results, the fact that they feel Hong Kong rather than Chinese? What is the meaning?
We can see over time that the Hong Kong identity has been rising, especially in these times when these pressures felt more. And now among young people, it's over 80% now completely identify as Hong Kong, as not Chinese at all, even try to ethnically distance themselves. So it is often an idea of these core values, which is very, very different from mainland China. But it's also, as you said, this the different language, very important, different historical experience, different lifestyles. These all come together to create this Hong Kong identity. And a lot of young people have this memory through their parents that this now has been destroyed by the Chinese influence.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron. Now, Mr. Harris, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the three witnesses for very penetrating and significant analysis for us. I will start with Mr. Chattigny. You mentioned that you assisted over 2,000 business immigrants into Canada through Quebec, their program, and can I ask you whether or not their entry into Canada was part of the, was seen by them as part of China's expansion throughout the world business-wise, or did they see that as an individual step for themselves? I'm sure it's an individual question, but is there a general trend there? Is this part of China's strategy of increasing its business interests elsewhere?
Merci beaucoup pour la question. Non, je n'ai pas.
Thank you for the question. The business people who immigrated from China to Canada was not part of a broader strategy or philosophy of economic expansionism. Most of the time, these business people wanted better opportunities for themselves and for their children. They wanted to send their children, for instance, to some of the best universities in the world. As you likely know, when business people apply, sometimes they remain in China and operate their businesses and their family immigrates to Canada.
My question. Can I ask you about the, we were looking at Hong Kong and the role of Hong Kong, the 30 years during which China expanded rapidly to become a significant power. Obviously, to some extent, that was dependent upon the finances raised in Hong Kong. And I'm wondering if do you have a comment on whether that would change now, or is it needed given the already rapid expansion that we have? Is China less dependent on Hong Kong and the finances there? Mr.
Dépendance. Oui, merci pour la question.
As for the economic ties between Hong Kong and China, 70% of market activity is Chinese companies. And there are important export and import ties between China and Hong Kong, but now have been reduced to 5%, whereas it used to be 29%. So there has been a drop in export-import. As for immigration, there are very few candidates from Hong Kong, but we think that will change in the next few years.
I was interested in your question regarding what Hong Kongers want versus what we want, and I know you may have mischaracterized my suggestion that what we want to see is hopefully see the rule of law play a more important role in Canada's relation to the world, and that would obviously include human rights in its strongest possible degree. But in terms of sometimes the lists of things that people are campaigning for, whether it's universal suffrage, whether it's the 5 demands, whether it's the local government aspect, the legislative demands, freedom, all of those things are all part of the same, as I see it. Are you suggesting that we ought to find the specific things that are on the agenda and look for ways to support them?
Thank you. I wasn't casting any imperialist intentions on anyone on those questions. But I want to say, apropos the question, which is relevant, is that as of July 7th, this 2020, 15,246,481 people have participated in 1,096 protests. This is all being documented, tracked on a regular basis by Hong Kong people and groups supporting analysis and research of what's happening. Are they monolithic? No, they are quite diverse in age and in background. There's the young, but you should note that 80% of those arrested in the movement last year were young, and young is not the Communist Party's definition of young, which goes up to 40, or 45. So they mean young, as in, under 30, I think. So there are social workers, there's civil servants, there's journalists, there's medical workers, there's the rapid growth of trade unions in Hong Kong as a result of the movement. So there's many things happening. The movement is diverse. However, bottom line, you've heard over and over, be water, leaderless, but the bottom line is that they are the 5 demands, of which only one has been reluctantly, painfully responded to, and the other 4 are still the demands. End of impunity for the police violence, universal suffrage as promised in One Country, Two Systems, and respect for the rights and freedoms. And I think that you can see the over 500,000 who voted in the primary Democratic and the massive victory of 17 of the 18 districts taken over by pandems. They were all a vote of confidence in this is what Hong Kong people want. And those are pretty strong signals.
Thank you, Professor. And I want to thank you in particular, although all 3 of you have done this, for giving us some hope that there's still a continuing effort being made, and that is something that Canada should support.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. And now we'll go on to the 5-minute round, the second round, pardon me, 5 minutes, Mr. Albus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to say thank you to all our witnesses for your testimony today. Mr. Chetgini, if you wouldn't mind, I'll start with you. I am concerned about the safety of the 300,000 plus Canadians that reside in Hong Kong. I'm also concerned that the Canadian government may or may not be ready in case many of them decide to come home, but many may also not have proper documentation, for example, a Canadian passport. I believe you've mentioned that the communist regime in China may exert some control over who can leave based on what travel documents they have. Is this a concern, and how does the Canadian government address it quickly?
Je dois encore une fois signaler que
Once again, I must mention that my expertise is generally with Quebec's Immigrant Investor Program. The government is best placed to handle immigration issues, especially the Department of Immigration.
We've had in this committee, we've had former Ambassador Mulrooney come and speak to us and talk to us about the need for Canada to take action, obviously working with allies, but also more importantly, rethink our foreign policy framework when it comes to China. Now, just the way that this has all happened in Hong Kong begs the question of whether or not China even respects its own policy of one China, two systems. I'm also concerned about what that may mean for other parts of that policy, including Taiwan. Do you believe that and I'm going to say this to Professor Hom first, and maybe I'll ask the other two to also speak to this. Do you believe that Taiwan will be the next target after Hong Kong?
I can't presume to be inside the minds of an authoritarian General Secretary Xi Jinping, but clearly Taiwan was in the minds of the Chinese leaders in 1984. The whole idea of one country, two system was so that Taiwan would be convinced that this is the solution to the reunification with the mainland. And that's because Deng Xiaoping thought that in the 50 years that the mainland would catch up and be more open and reform. However, since 2013, those hopes have been very sadly dashed by what Xi Jinping has done. Enough of that. But I think that Taiwan has very clearly looked at Hong Kong and said, one country, two system, not for us. So I think that is exacerbating the cross-straits tensions, because now it's very clear that the president of Taiwan has said clearly, we are not going to come back, and we're not. And they said that they can't declare independence. Well, they don't need to declare independence. It's already a country. So I think Canada should actually consider, and geopolitics is not my area, I'm just the human rights lawyer, is to really consider strengthening international support and recognition of ways diplomatic engagement with Taiwan that gives strength to Taiwan. It's not just Taiwan. We saw it in the region, the South China Seas. Japan is kind of nervous. Everyone's nervous in the region. So getting away with not following rule of law, trashing your own international obligations, ignoring international standards. It's not just in human rights law. It's in the maritime law, international maritime law. It's under treaty law. It's under all of this. And we see that this poses a danger, not only to the 300,000 Canadians, but to really 7.4 million people living in Hong Kong and in the region. So it is very important to hold the line on Hong Kong. We are the front line to defend the region.
Yes, I appreciate your testimony. Mr. Keating, you haven't had a chance to speak in my intervention. What do you think in terms of Taiwan will it be next?
Yeah, I agree with Professor Hom that it's very difficult to predict, but what I tried to say was that because China is driven by all these fears, that there could be very likely a miscalculation on one level in the Chinese regime, where they say, okay, maybe we have to please Xi Jinping, or Xi Jinping is worried about domestic unrest, dropping of the GDP, and then trying to deflect and feeding fueling the hyper-nationalism in China, that then unintended consequences or maybe intended consequences do happen. So I don't think there's a specific strategy to take Taiwan next, but it's always on the list of something to be resolved.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Albus.
Thank you, Mr. Albus. Mr. Dubourg, you have 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my turn to thank all witnesses for coming today and talk about this important issue. I don't have that much time. My question is for Ms. Ong, Professor Ong. Given your 18-year knowledge, you trained judges as well as lawyers. I'd like you to share your knowledge with us. In a May 2020 interview at Hong Kong Free Press, you said change always comes from people rather than reforms brought by the government. Given this national security law, do you still think that pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong will be successful eventually?
I need to retire for real so I can reflect on the whole experience of 20 years. But I think quickly, one thing that's very important from the training work I did on the mainland is that you need to build the personnel infrastructure. You don't just build rule of law with no people. So that's why it was very important to train the young lawyers, the young teachers. And indeed, they are the ones who are now having to carry and fight that steep challenge of legal reforms on the mainland. And they are indeed still doing that. With respect to, I'm very intimidated that this committee, more than any government committee I've ever appeared before, has actually gone and read our writings and then come back and throw our writings back at us. I do. And I think that's the human rights part. I think that as an intellectual and intellectually, not as an intellectual, intellectually, I have a certain degree of pessimism and a certain degree, but as a human rights lawyer and activist, we really don't have the luxury of pessimism, that our job is to make sure that we provide solidarity, we create the safe space for Hong Kongers to be able to continue the work, because they have put a full-page ad, the Hong Kong Student Union has put a full-page ad that says, we will die, we will give our lives for freedom, with a whole powerful opening letter that quotes Hannah Arendt on totalitarianism. So I think even in these dire circumstances, you are seeing these students, these young people continue to speak out. And I have to add that on the mainland, where we have now seen more than 75 years of real repression and ecosystem, you have support for Hong Kongers, and they are being prosecuted, and they have gone to prison, and they have suffered harassment. And Douban, which is the largest online social media platform for reviewing films and social media, they have millions. They just posted, someone, despite all of this repression, a comment reviewing the national security law in Hong Kong. And they had the nerve and courage to give it 1 star.
Mm-hmm.
That, yes, to me is like to show, why do we think we'll win? Because you can't kill us all. And the big cartoon is the rooster. You can kill all the roosters. It's not going to stop the dawn. It just won't.
Okay. Fact. Yeah, thank you so much. Just one more question, if I have the time. Let me put in French. Oui, juste une autre question.
Another question, if I still have time. You trained those lawyers. You even said that a translation of that new law is not right. So how will those young lawyers be able to defend other people? Could Canada help in that case?
a terrific way to look, because Canada was involved in many legal exchange, rule of law exchanges, just like the US, just like the EU. And I think those legal exchanges, if you're going to engage and do something helpful, it's to think about technical support, because mainland lawyers do not know Hong Kong common law, and Hong Kong lawyers do not know mainland socialist legality, whatever version you want to say it. So we need to have some training up on that. And also to note that the Hong Kong legal academics have been engaged since July 1 on organizing legal, detailed workshops on how do we elaborate and understand, and we should be supporting those efforts.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Dubourg. And now Mr. Janis for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Dubourg.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. This has been, I think, a really inspiring panel. Professor Hom, thank you for your call to optimism. We've seen how people-powered movements have been able to bring about incredible change in environments that maybe it wasn't expected. And I think the courage you speak of from these Hong Kong protesters can be an example for us as parliamentarians. Sometimes we hear people say, well, we should be cautious and because we should be afraid of the consequences if the Chinese government retaliates. But we have this inspiring example of people who are aware of major consequences to their own lives, their security, and are yet courageously standing up for justice and for freedom. And I just note as well that we just celebrated 75 years since victory in the Pacific, and honoring Canadian soldiers who gave their lives for the freedom of Hong Kong. And I hope that we as a committee, as parliamentarians, continue with their example in mind, as well as the example of these protesters. I wonder if you can speak to the potential positive downstream effects of the stand being taken by people in Hong Kong. We've talked about the downstream negative effects of how the Chinese government might follow up what's happening with action in Taiwan and elsewhere. What about the downstream positive effects when people stand up for their fundamental rights inside of Hong Kong? What is the likelihood about how this will impact people's response to abuses of human rights on the mainland?
Thank you, Mr. Jennison. I'm so sorry I missed meeting with you in February when I was in Vancouver speaking. So I'm so glad I get to finally see and meet you, and I hope we have some follow-up opportunity. Downstream positive effects. First, there's actually downstream positive effects for each other in the movement, that when we see each voice, each ad, each action, it's so inspiring to each other. The second is its downstream effects and that's why Beijing censorship must control it. It has a downstream positive, inspiring effect for mainland human rights defenders and just ordinary citizens on the mainland. Thirdly, it's not just downstream effect flowing one way. It's one big global trend against authoritarian regimes. Belarus, against police violence, the US. So we're seeing a mutual learning, not only, and also Tibet, which we have the Tibetan and the Uyghur movements. These are all mutually inspiring each other and learning from each other in terms of strategies. But I think the Hong Kong movement has been particularly inspiring because Hong Kong people have taken on, against all odds, an incredibly what the diplomatic community views as impossible to take on because of too cautious. So I would say the time for naivete is indeed over, but it's also clear the time is over for the 30-year assumption that engagement with China strategy was working. So I think it's time for a reboot, reset of that strategy. And at the core of that strategy, it should be people.
Thank you very much. I wonder if you can follow up on the question of sanctions as well, because there's been discussion of both panels about sanctions. I didn't hear any of our witnesses today say they were against targeted Magnitsky sanctions. I heard concerns about making sure that our sanctions were targeted against human rights abusers, that we weren't imposing sort of broad, poorly targeted, kind of whole economy impacting sanctions anyways, which frankly is the trend in sanctions anyways, to be focused on those who are guilty while not trying to impact those who are innocent. Do you want to comment on how we can effectively target sanctions to not impact the wrong people, but to impact those who are responsible for repression?
I agree with Mr. Keating that as broad as possible and targeted individuals, and those would be individuals who are in the United Front, in the police, in the administration, the Hong Kong SAR. But I also want to direct you to the fact that extensive lists of individuals and what they have done have already been compiled by Hong Kong people. And I would urge the committee to review those lists. And when you urge targeted sanctions, pick your targets, because I'm telling you there are hundreds. And then the second part of targeted sanctions is threatening it is not good enough. There has to be an actual follow through, and that you have to actually see it. Thirdly, mainland leaders in Hong Kong have literal investments in the outcome of Hong Kong in a way that protects their invested privileged positions in the real estate and everywhere. And I think they need to be targeted broadly. And these individuals have all been identified.
Yeah, that's the genius of Magnitsky sanctions, right? They're targeting the individuals, not the people. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Jenness. And now we'll go on to Ms. Zan for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry to keep asking questions of the same witness, but I am very curious because she had mentioned, I'm trying to find, there's my screen again. You had mentioned that, Professor, Madam, that the people in mainland China were also, that there were a number of people who were concerned about what is going on in Hong Kong. And I had mentioned at another committee the other day that I had also seen on television interviews with people living in the Republic of China who did not seem to think that this new law was particularly a problem, and that they felt that it was more to protect China as a whole and to protect them. Could you please elaborate on just how much people in mainland China actually know about what is going on, and what is the majority of thought when it comes to the changes that the government is trying to implement in Hong Kong?
I think that if we say that 7.4 million people in Hong Kong are quite diverse, well, certainly over 1 billion people are also quite diverse.
Of course.
I think we should keep in mind that when you see mainlanders being interviewed on public TV, of course, you should be aware of what they can say. And of course, some of them actually do believe in wolf warrior diplomacy, but I also do believe that anyone speaking on TV, any forced confession will tell you, you have to be very cautious what you say. What I do think is an indication, despite that was my point, is that you are seeing ordinary mainlanders, not activists, a taxi driver, just ordinary mainlanders who post on social media support for Hong Kong people, and they got picked up. So I think that's an indication of how powerful, despite all the censorship, you can't shut down the information flow. Even with the law, even with all the apparatus of law and security and technology apparatus. And we didn't even talk about the technology aspects of all of this. And perhaps that would be a good follow-up hearing. But I think that, so that's extremely important. But we have actually looked at and tried to compile cases of mainlanders who supported. And I said, I think that that's quite shocking that and encouraging that this one person, because mainland law requires real name registration. That means when you post online or do anything online in the mainland, you have to register with your real name. That means they can track you down, they know your IP address. So that one person who posted a 1-star review to the Hong Kong national security law was really courageous to say that, because that is really, so you can say anything you want in China as long as it is consistent with what the party narrative is. The minute you even question or characterize it, you could run afoul of incitement, sedition, disloyalty, anti-China, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not sure if I answered the question.
Yeah, no. Thank you very much. Now, earlier you had also mentioned, I'm a little bit confused because you had mentioned that we should be very careful and not completely cut off Hong Kong and not completely act as if they are dead, and to realize that still, the environment is thriving to try to be as democratic as possible under great odds. And you also mentioned that we should not be doing certain sanctions that will hurt all of the Chinese people. So when you're talking about targeted sanctions, are you only talking about targeted sanctions? You're not suggesting that we do broad sweeping sanctions in agriculture and say seafood exports and things like this to China?
I'm not an economist or a expert on any of those things. We haven't taken any really strong position on general sanctions because I think that requires expertise beyond our human rights. However, one of the Confucius Institutes that's about to close down, exports lobster to China. And so they're not going to close down because of the problem of lobsters. So I think one should think about, I know that there are other interests, but targeted sanctions, as I said already, I don't want to repeat in a limited time, can work if you target more than the 12. There's actually a meme in Hong Kong circulating, and I won't say it because of the words, on the film from Ocean's 11, and then they said Ocean's, well, here they are. So when I said not cut off Hong Kong, what I was trying to emphasize is, yes, urgent humanitarian solutions as everyone is focusing on to get those out who need to get out.
Thank you.
I'm urging,
thank you,
pay attention to the situation of those who choose to remain or can't leave. That's what I meant.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you, Ms. Zan. Et maintenant,
And now, Mr. Bergeron, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, on the matter of sanctions, it seems to me that if we want to harm the People's Republic of China, perhaps it would be worth it to look at sanctions that will have an impact on the economic efficiency of Hong Kong. Be that as it may, perhaps the witnesses would like to weigh in on the matter, but I would like to come back to Madame Hom on in the questions posed by Mr. Dubourg, Canada's role in the law. We have a bilingual bijudicial system in Canada, and how can we help you with that?
The legal experts, particularly in Hong Kong, who are in the universities and in the law schools, who are doing very concrete technical work on thinking about constructively what can be done both to interpret, apply, implement, and to narrow the law. As we know, national security law and criminal law under common law jurisprudence must be interpreted and applied as restrictively and narrowly as possible, not broadly. That is just a general rule. Secondly, I think that I think we need to focus on those things you can do, not just to punish and threaten and condemn, but to proactively, constructively support. So, for example, China is an observer member of the Arctic Circle Council. Canada is important at the Arctic Circle Council. And I think the ways to think about, just like an environmental sustainability, Canada and other countries engage in environmental sustainability analysis and assessment of all of your trade and other actions. You need to do this with human rights. You need to integrate it into investment. You need to integrate human rights due diligence, or you haven't exercised due diligence, either as a government policy or for companies.
15 secondes. Alors,
15 seconds. Would Madame Hom like to weigh in on the issue of harming the
Simply, I do not believe in harming the Hong Kong generally, but I think that just goes without saying. The trick is how to do razor type surgery, not beating people with a bat.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Harris, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and I hope you can hear me. I had to switch to a cell phone because my Surface Flow ran out of battery.
Yes, we do.
Okay, thanks. So my first question is for Professor, or Mr. Keating, rather. it's been suggested by earlier witnesses that Hong Kong could go either way. We've seen arrests of high-profile people in a quick crackdown. Not that others haven't been arrested too, mind you. And of course, but the law itself is open to terrific amount of selective enforcement, and it could go either way. They could keep that up or go taper off. Does it matter in one? Can you predict? Of course you can't. But does it matter what reaction we would have? Does that have any effect on the reaction that we as Canadians should have?
Thank you very much for the question. Of course, you're right that we don't know how they will apply this, but I think we can see that what Carrie Lam said at the beginning, it will be only a very small number of people, that this is not true, that is broader than we all feared. So I think without a reaction from Canada and like-minded countries, I think they will assume that this is now accepted, and we have been successful in intimidating Hong Kong people and actually getting our what we want from Hong Kong without any reaction from the international community. So I think there should be a reaction on this by Canada.
Thank you. And Professor Hom, could you add to what you said before? Of course, you've been quoted as saying you have faith in the long arc of history bending towards justice. I think that's a very hopeful and a purposeful comment. And that added to that is that the Hong Kongers know that they have to play the long game. And Jimmy Lau has talked even since his recent arrest about maybe the tactical changes might have to take place in order to be effective and creative in the longer run. Can you tell us what the next steps might be for the pro-democracy movement and what we should be watching for and encouraging in whatever way we can?
In 15 seconds, please.
Take Article 4 of the National Security Law and ICCPR protection seriously, and in particular with Article 55 jurisdiction of cases that are brought to the mainland. They cannot be under the mainland criminal security law and the criminal procedure law, which they will be subject to, but we have to have the international community, and Canada must speak out to ensure that any case that first goes taken to the mainland must comply with due process protections under Article 4 of the National Security Law, the ICCPR, and also they're being cautious about that right now, because the first case they bring in will generate and should generate international scrutiny to the very tiny moment.
Thank you, Professor. We're over Mr. Harris's time, and we've come to the end of our second panel and the end of the meeting. First of all, on behalf of all the members, we are very grateful to the witnesses today for your presence and your time and your testimony. Thank you so much for that. I see members applauding from their distant locations. And I want to remind members that our next meeting is next Tuesday, the 25th of August at 11 Eastern. Or for those of us in Nova Scotia, that's noon, of course. And
Thank you very much, everybody.
Half an hour later. Thank you so much, and bye for now.
Thank you so much. 谢谢。
Meeting is adjourned.